There is something living above you right now, not in any way you could see from the ground, not with a telescope pointed at the right altitude, not with radar calibrated for upper atmospheric tracking, not with any instrument built for the lower sky, where birds and planes and weather balloons spend their days. Whatever lives up there inhabits a place so far removed from ordinary surface experience that for hundreds of millions of years, within the logic of its own world, no one even knew it was there. Its name was not spoken because the people who might have spoken it did not yet exist. Its shape crossed the sky in long coiling arcs above the forming continents and the churning primordial oceans, and if somehow someone had been below to look up at exactly the right moment, they would have seen it pass and thought it was a meteor. That is exactly what the Pokemon Company says it looks like. The Pokédex entry says plainly that even in flight its appearance is indistinguishable from a meteor, a streak of luminous green against the dark of the upper atmosphere, curving with the momentum of something that has been moving through that sky for longer than most of the geological features below it have existed, ancient and enormous and alone in a way that the word alone does not come close to describing, because there is nothing else at that altitude to be alone from. The ozone layer, where it has lived for hundreds of millions of years, is not a habitat in any sense that biology normally considers. It is the edge of the planet, and Rayquaza lives there. Its name is Rayquaza, and the lore built around it across more than 2 decades of games, films, anime, manga, and competitive formats is one of the most intricate, mythologically rich, and genuinely affecting bodies of storytelling the Pokemon franchise has produced. We are talking about a creature whose canonical history reaches back to the geological formation of the Hoenn region itself. A creature whose ability to mega evolve rewrote the entire understood history of that mechanic across the franchise. A creature that flew into actual outer space and destroyed an asteroid with a single move, and then fought an alien Pokemon in the vacuum above the planet. A creature so comprehensively dominant in competitive play that the organized competitive community had to invent an entirely new tier category simply to give it somewhere to exist. And now, in Pokemon Horizons, the most recent anime series, it is a jet black shiny Rayquaza sealed for roughly a century in an ancient Pokeball at the bottom of the ocean, waiting for a boy to become someone it finds worthy of partnership. We are going to cover all of it, every layer, every mythological source that fed the design, every piece of Pokédex lore and in-game dialogue that builds the picture of what this creature actually is. The ancient war that shaped the Hoenn region and called Rayquaza down for the first time, the Draconid people and their 2,000 years of institutional memory, the Delta episode and what it reveals about the true origin of mega evolution, the specific biology of the Mikado organ, the rivalry with Deoxys, the black Rayquaza of Pokemon Horizons, and the adventurer named Lucius, and the competitive ban so unprecedented it forced Smogon to restructure their entire tier system. This is one of those subjects where the further in you go, the more it gives back. Drop a comment right now with where you are in the world and what time it is there. I love seeing where this channel reaches, and I check every single one. If you are new here and you have not subscribed yet, do it now, because this is exactly the kind of deep, careful coverage we make all the time, and you will not want to miss what comes after this. Part 1, The Legend. Before the world was made to understand Rayquaza properly, you have to begin before Rayquaza enters the story. You have to go back to a period in the history of the Hoenn region, so geologically remote that the region itself had not yet taken its recognizable form. The story of Rayquaza is, at its structural foundation, a creation myth, not a universal creation myth in the sense of explaining how existence began, because the Pokemon world has its own cosmological origin tradition for that. This is a creation myth in the more local and perhaps more intimate sense, a story about how a specific place in the world came to have the shape it does, why its geography is the way it is, and what ancient forces were responsible for making it. That making was violent in ways that are difficult to translate into human-scaled language. Long before any human being set foot in what would become the Hoenn region, before there were routes or cities or gyms or any of the infrastructure of the Pokemon world, two beings existed. Two creatures of such age and elemental saturation that the distinction between them and the forces they embodied was essentially philosophical. One was land-given will, the other was ocean-given hunger, and neither was willing to yield any portion of the natural energy they both required. Primal Groudon is the land creature. In its primal form, which Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire establish as its fully unrestrained expression of elemental nature, Groudon radiates such intense heat that precipitation evaporates before reaching the ground beneath it. Its movements have tectonic consequences. When it settles, volcanic activity follows. The Pokédex entries describe it as having created continental land, and the in-universe lore of the Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire era treats this seriously. Primal Groudon is not a large Pokemon with fire powers. It is a geological process given the ability to choose a direction. Primal Kyogre is its counterpart and its opposite, a creature of oceanic depth and water typing. In its primal form, Kyogre can call up rainstorms that last for years, generate waves that reshape coastlines, and flood any terrain Groudon creates with enough sustained pressure to eventually move stone. It draws natural energy from the world's oceans directly, becoming what the Pokédex calls the personification of the seas. Where Groudon expands land, Kyogre expands water. Where Groudon creates desert, Kyogre creates flood. Before the Hoenn region had its present form, these two beings were fighting, not out of personal hatred, not from strategic rivalry in any recognizable sense, but structurally. Both were drawn to concentrations of natural energy, and there was not enough of it anywhere to fully satisfy both without one of them having less. So they fought for it, and they had been fighting for it for long enough that the fighting itself had become a force of creation. The shifting of land and sea caused by their conflict-shaped coastlines. Volcanic activity triggered by the heat of Groudon, meeting the moisture of Kyogre, built and destroyed islands. The clash between expansion and flooding created varied terrain. The Hoenn region, in the cosmological lore of the Pokemon world, is the physical record of this war. Its distinctive geography, the mix of water routes and elevated terrain and diverse climate zones, is what the battleground between two primordial elemental beings looks like after geological time has had its way with the wreckage. This is stated most clearly in the mural account that Zinnia narrates during the Delta episode of Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, describing a world overflowing with natural energy as Primal Gruden and Primal Kyogre clashed endlessly, causing disaster for everything living between them. There were things living between them. Even in this ancient period, people inhabited the area near the forming region. One group specifically, a tribe of dragon-type trainers, had made their home near a waterfall. In the geography of the present-day games, this waterfall is in the area called Meteor Falls in western Hoenn. These people were watching an ongoing geological catastrophe from whatever position of relative safety they had managed to establish, building lives in a landscape that kept being reshaped by forces they had no means to address. And then, in the Delta episode timeline, approximately 2,000 years before the events of Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, something fell from the sky onto that waterfall. Not routine atmospheric debris. The Delta episode describes it as a storm of meteoroids, a concentrated impact event significant enough to be historically distinct, and the meteoroids came down glowing with what the in-game text calls a rainbow light. That rainbow light, when traced through the subsequent lore of the franchise, is connected to the same energetic quality as keystones and megastones, the transformative materials that would eventually become the defining mechanic of Pokemon X and Y. The meteoroids that struck Meteor Falls 2,000 years ago were carrying something more than rock and mineral. They carried a resonance with processes deep in the elemental structure of the Pokemon world, and that resonance reached Rayquaza. It descended. This was not a trainer's command, not a Pokeball's mechanism, not any human will being imposed from outside. The legendary and mythical guidebook describes Rayquaza as having a never-ending appetite for doing what is right, which frames the descent as reflecting a moral orientation, a drive toward action when the situation of the world requires it. Other elements of the lore suggest a physical trigger as well. The specific energy of the rainbow glowing meteoroids resonating with whatever biological systems in Rayquaza respond to planetary emergencies. The most coherent reading of all available evidence is that both were true simultaneously. A physical signal reached something in Rayquaza's nature, and that nature was oriented toward responding to that kind of signal with intervention. Whatever the precise mechanism, it descended, and what happened when it arrived is one of the pivotal events in the entire history of the Pokemon world, though it would not be recognized as such by anyone outside the Draconid tradition for 2,000 years. Rayquaza, arriving above the region where Primal Gruden and Primal Kyogre were engaged in their ancient conflict, overpowered both of them. Not through strategy, not by exploiting some temporary weakness, not with the assistance of anyone else. Both ancient Pokemon, in their fully powered primal forms, the most powerful states they are capable of reaching, were overwhelmed and driven back. Groudon retreated into the earth. Kyogre retreated into the ocean depths. And the geological catastrophe that had been shaping the Hoenn region ceased. The tribe living at the waterfall witnessed this. We have no first-person account from that period. The games do not attempt to reconstruct individual experiences from 2,000 years ago. But the inference from what the Draconid people subsequently built and maintained is clear. What they witnessed changed their understanding of the world in a fundamental way, and they committed the rest of their civilization's existence to maintaining a relationship with the thing that came from the sky and stopped the disaster. That relationship, and the specific forms it took over the following 2,000 years, is the framework within which most of Rayquaza's lore operates. Part 2. What is Rayquaza? Actually, the Pokédex entries for Rayquaza are, if read carefully and taken seriously, as documents about a real creature within the internal logic of its world, among the stranger pieces of biological description in the franchise. They are building a picture of something that exists in a category so far outside ordinary experience that the language of biology struggles to contain it. Rayquaza is Pokemon number 384, the sky-high Pokemon, dragon and flying type. It stands at just over 7 meters in base form, reaching over 10 meters in mega form. It has 105 HP, 150 attack, 90 defense, 150 special attack, 90 special defense, and 95 speed for a base stat total of 680. These numbers place it among the most powerful legendary Pokemon of its generation, and well above the vast majority of non-legendary Pokemon. They are impressive numbers. But the numbers are almost beside the point when you read the Pokédex entries, because those entries are doing something different from cataloging competitive statistics. They are describing a creature that has been alive for longer than most of the geology below it. The key phrases, repeated across multiple generations of Pokédex entries, with a consistency that indicates the designers considered them fundamental. Rayquaza lived for hundreds of millions of years in the Earth's ozone layer, never descending to the ground. Its existence had been completely unknown because it lived so high in the sky. Even in flight, its appearance is indistinguishable from that of a meteor. Hundreds of millions of years is a number that loses meaning at human scales, so it is worth grounding. In Earth's real geological and biological history, complex animal life appears in the fossil record roughly 600 million years ago. The first land plants emerged around 470 million years ago. The entire Mesozoic era, from the emergence of dinosaurs to the asteroid impact that ended non-avian dinosaurs, spanned about 180 million years. A creature that has existed for hundreds of millions of years would on Earth's real timeline have been ancient before forests existed. It would have been circling in the sky above a world that was still figuring out how to build multicellular animal life. In the Pokemon world, this means Rayquaza predates the Hoenn region by an enormous margin. It was circling in the ozone layer when Primal Groudon and Primal Kyogre began their geological conflict that would eventually create Hoenn. It may have been there for hundreds of millions of years before that conflict started. The age of Rayquaza places it in a different temporal category from anything else the franchise describes, except possibly Arceus and the Creation Trio, and those exist in a different cosmological register entirely. Never descending to the ground is the second phrase worth sitting with. The Pokédex says that Rayquaza lived for hundreds of millions of years in the ozone layer and never descended to the ground. The Sapphire Era entry adds that it was said it would descend if Kyogre and Groudon were to fight. These two statements together establish Rayquaza's relationship to the surface of the world as defined entirely by exceptional circumstance. The surface is not its home. Descending is not its ordinary behavior, Descending is what it does when conditions reach a threshold its nature compels it to address. This makes every descent in the lore a meaningful event, not just a Pokemon showing up for a battle, but an exception to a rule that has held for geological ages. When Rayquaza descends, the world is in the kind of danger that nothing else can address. That is the specific definition of the exception, and the rarity of it is what gives the Draconid tradition its weight. They found a way to invoke the exception deliberately, to reach across the boundary between surface and sky, and make Rayquaza's nature respond to a genuine need. The ozone layer as a habitat requires some acknowledgement of how strange this actually is. In our world, the ozone layer is a region of the upper stratosphere, roughly 15 to 35 kilometers above sea level, where ozone molecules are concentrated enough to absorb most incoming ultraviolet radiation. Nothing lives there in any sense that real biology recognizes. The pressure is a tiny fraction of surface pressure. The temperatures are bitterly cold at the lower boundary and somewhat warmer at the upper boundary from UV absorption. Complex organisms, as we know them, fail immediately in those conditions. Rayquaza has been living there for hundreds of millions of years. The in-game science, through Devon Corporation researchers, in the Delta episode of Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, offers a partial account of how Rayquaza consumes small meteoroids that fall into the atmosphere from space, and these meteoroids merge with its internal energy to provide a biological power source unlike anything available to surface-dwelling creatures. The implicit biology is that Rayquaza runs on cosmic fuel, on material forged in stellar processes and traveling through the interplanetary medium before falling through Earth's upper atmosphere. It eats what crosses the boundary it lives at. This is, as world building goes, genuinely elegant. Rayquaza lives at the edge of the atmosphere. It eats what falls through the edge of the atmosphere from space. Its diet is the boundary itself. Every meteoroid it consumes is a piece of the cosmos, becoming part of the creature that guards the cosmos's interface with the planet. The Sun and Moon era Pokédex entries added a further dimension. In the Alola region, Rayquaza is considered a natural predator of Minior, a Pokemon that also inhabits the ozone layer, coalescing from accumulated space dust into a rocky shell around a colored mineral core. When Minior's shell is destroyed and it falls too far from its natural altitude, it dissolves back into the particles that formed it. Those particles are, the lore implies, the kind of atmospheric material that Rayquaza feeds on. This creates a coherent food chain at the very edge of the atmosphere. Space material accumulates into Minior. Minior dissolves into atmospheric particles when its shell fails. Rayquaza consumes those particles along with the meteoroids. An ecosystem at the edge of the planet, with Rayquaza at its apex. The observation that Rayquaza in flight looks like a meteor is worth examining from multiple angles because it is doing different kinds of work simultaneously. On the most literal level, it is visual, a large, luminous object moving at high speed through the upper atmosphere, elongated, curving with its trajectory, would absolutely be perceived from below as a meteoroid on a shallow atmospheric entry angle. The ring markings along Rayquaza's body, energized by whatever processes sustain a creature-consuming cosmic material, would contribute to the luminous effect. On another level, it describes ecological integration. Rayquaza has lived in a region dense with meteoroids for hundreds of millions of years. Over that span, it has come to visually resemble the objects it hunts and the environment it inhabits. Whether this is intentional biological camouflage or simply the visual consequence of centuries of absorbing the materials that meteoroids are made of is left ambiguous. But the result is a creature effectively invisible from below, indistinguishable from background phenomena that observers have learned to categorize as normal and stop attending to. On a third level, and this is the one that resonates with the mythological dimension of Rayquaza's design, the meteor appearance is a statement about what kind of entity this is. Meteors cross the boundary between space and atmosphere as a natural, continuous, unremarkable process. Something falls from outside, passes through the edge of the planet, burns in the crossing, or makes it through. Rayquaza, which lives at that boundary and eats what crosses it and looks like the things that cross it, is in some fundamental sense the living embodiment of that boundary. It is not a surface creature. It is not a space creature. It is the threshold itself, given form and will and the orientation toward keeping the threshold intact. That is what the Draconid people eventually understood about it, and it is what makes their response to witnessing its first ascent, the decision to build a tower and a tradition oriented toward reaching it again, the appropriate response rather than simply a dramatic one. Part 3. The real-world mythology behind the dragon. Every great Pokémon design is a synthesis of real-world sources passed through the specific visual and narrative language of the franchise. The best legendary designs feel as though they predate the games, because in a meaningful sense they do, drawn from traditions genuinely older than anything in contemporary culture. Rayquaza draws from at least 4 distinct world mythological traditions simultaneously, and understanding each one illuminates why the design is built the way it is, and why its role in the lore takes its specific shape. The most extensively documented and most frequently cited parallel is with Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent deity of Mesoamerican mythology. Quetzalcoatl appears across multiple Central American civilizations, including the Aztec and Maya, where the equivalent figure is called Kukulchan. He is complex in the primary sources, associated with wind, air, learning, and creation across different traditions. But his most relevant characteristic for understanding Rayquaza is cosmological. Quetzalcoatl is described in Aztec accounts as having created the boundary between the earth and the sky, establishing the division between the terrestrial realm and the celestial realm above it. He is the deity of the threshold, the being whose existence defines where one domain ends and another begins. Rayquaza's structural position in the Weather Trio maps precisely onto this. Groudon controls the land, Kyogre controls the sea. Rayquaza inhabits the edge of the sky, the boundary between the planet and the cosmic space beyond it, and it descends to impose order when the forces of land and sea threaten to overwhelm each other. The functional parallel is primary. Both are defined by the threshold position, by the role of maintaining the division between great elemental domains. The visual parallel, A long green serpent capable of aerial movement reinforces the functional one. The Chinese dragon tradition, the long, is probably the most visually dominant influence. Chinese dragons are typically depicted as long, sinuous, serpentine creatures navigating the sky without conventional wings, associated with weather and the regulation of natural atmospheric processes. They are benevolent forces, in Chinese cosmological thinking, creatures of order and balance that maintain harmony in the natural world and intervene when that harmony breaks down. The behavioral description maps onto Rayquaza with striking precision. The long serpentine form coiling through the atmosphere, the association with weather control, the temperament of a creature that is not aggressive toward the surface world under ordinary conditions, but becomes formidably powerful when the situation requires it. The three-clawed hands are a specific detail that places Rayquaza within the Japanese dragon tradition rather than the Chinese. Chinese dragons are most commonly depicted with 5 claws, associated in imperial iconography with the emperor's dragon. Japanese dragons, drawing from the broader East Asian tradition but adapted through a different cultural lens, are typically shown with 3 claws. Japanese dragons are also specifically associated with sky guardianship and are depicted as protective rather than threatening figures. Rayquaza's 3 claws located in this lineage, which makes contextual sense as Pokemon is a Japanese creation. This Japanese connection is reinforced by the deliberate naming of the Mikado organ, the internal biological structure that allows Rayquaza to mega-evolve. Mikado is a Japanese term meaning emperor, and more specifically a poetic word for the Emperor of Japan, sometimes translated as Heavenly Sovereign or King of the Sky. The organ that allows Rayquaza to reach its most fully expressed form is named after the concept of divine imperial authority over the heavens. This is not an accident of translation. It is a deliberate connection between Rayquaza's transformative power and the Japanese cultural tradition of sky-ruling sovereign authority. The Lindworm tradition from Scandinavian and Northern European folklore contributes the specific body plan. The Lindworm is a serpentine dragon, sometimes depicted with small front limbs and no wings, sometimes with vestigial wings, fundamentally serpentine in structure rather than relying on wingspan for aerial movement. It appears in Norse and Germanic folk tales as a creature of great age and morally ambiguous character, connected to the deep patterns of the natural world rather than to the treasure-hoarding destructive behavior of European fire dragons. The physical description, long-bodied, near-limbless or small-limbed, ancient, powerful, maps clearly onto Rayquaza's body plan. The Ziz from Hebrew and Judeo-Christian mythology is perhaps the most structurally perfect parallel because it positions Rayquaza within a 3-creature elemental hierarchy that mirrors the weather trio exactly. In ancient Hebrew texts, the Ziz rules the sky, the Behemoth rules the land, and the Leviathan rules the sea. 3 primordial creatures, each governing a domain, the sky creature positioned as the force capable of maintaining order when the land and sea forces conflict. Grudon is the Behemoth, Sakyogri is the Leviathan. Rayquaza is the Ziz. The structure is identical down to the power dynamic. The Sky Ruler is the one that can contain the other 2 when they threaten to overwhelm the world. The Nazca line's connection is visual and carries its own thematic resonance. The ring markings that run along Rayquaza's body from head to tail have been compared to the Nazca lines of southern Peru, enormous geoglyphs created by the Nazca civilization between roughly 500 BCE and 500 CE, including serpentine forms and geometric patterns so large they can only be properly perceived from above. The Nazca lines are widely understood as figures created for aerial perspective, art made for something looking down. The parallel to a creature that has spent hundreds of millions of years above the surface, looking down at a world it rarely touches, carries a quiet appropriateness. The comet and dragon association from Northern European mythology adds one more strand. The comet that gave the name Pendragon to the legendary British king Uther, father of Arthur, was interpreted in that mythological tradition as a great dragon crossing the sky. The word draconid itself, shared by the Hoenn tribe in the games and the real-world meteor shower, comes from the Latin for dragon. Comets, meteoroids, and serpentine creatures crossing the night sky are connected across multiple traditions by their visual similarity from below. A streak of light moving through darkness in a curved path, burning as it travels. Rayquaza, which the Pokédex says is indistinguishable from a meteor in flight, is the living expression of this ancient visual identification. The meteor that has always been alive. The dragon that people have been seeing cross the sky for as long as there have been people to look up. All of these sources working together produce something original that feels ancient, a design that seems to have existed before the games, waiting to be found rather than invented. Part 4. The Birth of a God. What the Draconid people did in the immediate aftermath of Rayquaza's first descent established the framework that the subsequent 2,000 years of their civilization would operate within. They were people who had just witnessed something beyond any frame of reference they had. The cessation of a geological catastrophe accomplished in the immediate term by a force that came from the upper sky and simply overpowered the things that had been destroying the world. Let us be precise about the nature of what Rayquaza did, because it matters for understanding what kind of being this is. It did not negotiate. It did not find a compromise solution that satisfied both primal Pokémon. It did not mediate or diplomatize or appeal to any principle that Groudon and Kyogre recognized. It applied superior force. Primal Groudon and Primal Kyogre, both in their fully powered states, the most powerful forms they are capable of reaching, were overwhelmed by something that had more raw capability than both of them. They retreated. That is the nature of the peace Rayquaza creates. A power balance enforced by the existence of something more powerful than either party in the conflict. This is important because it characterizes the balance Rayquaza maintains in the Pokémon world correctly. It is not a diplomatic balance achieved through agreement and respected by all parties. It is a power balance maintained by the existence and periodic assertion of something capable of overpowering both parties simultaneously. The peace of Hoenn is the peace that comes from the presence of something strong enough to make conflict pointless. The Draconid people understood this in immediate practical terms. The ancient Pokémon had retreated, but retreat is not surrender. Primal Groton and Primal Kyogre had been fighting for geological ages before this intervention, and the intervention had not eliminated either of them or resolved the underlying tension between their elemental natures. They had retreated to depths where Rayquaza did not follow them, which meant they could, in theory, be woken up again by the right conditions. This is exactly what happened 1,000 years later when a meteoroid struck the area that would become Sootopolis City. The impact released enough concentrated natural energy to awaken both primal Pokémon simultaneously, and they rose to fight again. But this time, the Draconid people had the ritual. The lore keeper of that generation made the specific invocation, offered the wish in front of the rainbow stone, and Rayquaza descended again. This time, in response to the invocation and the energy of the stone, it transformed. The Draconid accounts describe it taking on a more powerful form, which the Delta episode confirms was what later generations would call Mega Evolution. And in that form, it drove both primal Pokémon back. This is the event that produced the inscription at Sky Pillar. The gratitude and recognition of the Draconid people after the second descent, combined with the knowledge that the cycle would come again in another 1,000 years, led them to build a permanent monument. Sky Pillar was constructed as both a tribute to Rayquaza and a repository for the knowledge that future generations would need. The murals on its walls are a technical document. What happened, what the conditions were, what the invocation required, what the transformation looked like. Preserved in stone, because stone lasts longer than memory. The second descent also established the specific form of the Draconid ritual with greater precision than the first had. The first descent appeared spontaneous, triggered by the combination of the meteoroid impact and the conditions of the crisis below. The second descent was deliberately invoked by the lore keeper using the rainbow stone. This gave the Draconid tradition a clearer model. The right person, the right artifact, the right invocation. 3 components, all necessary. And the tradition of the lore keeper was formalized around ensuring that all 3 would be available when the cycle returned again. 1,000 more years passed. The asteroid the Devon Corporation eventually detected through space telescopes was the return of that cycle. And Zinnia, carrying 2,000 years of accumulated tradition and the personal grief of a responsibility that should have been someone else's, was the lore keeper prepared to meet it. Part 5. The Draconid People. The Draconid people are, among all the significant figures in Rayquaza's extended lore, the human ones. Not legendary Pokémon with cosmic significance, not mythological beings operating on geological scales, but a tribe of people who watched the sky for 2,000 years and built an institution around what they saw and what they needed it to mean. The name carries its meanings openly. Draco is Latin for dragon. The Draconids are among the most active annual meteor showers visible from Earth, named for the constellation Draco, from which the meteors appear to radiate in October. In Japanese, the name of the Draconid people translates most directly as meteor people. Both layers of the name are intentional. People who identify with dragons, people who identify with falling stars, people whose entire cultural identity is organized around the relationship between draconic beings and the cosmic debris that falls through the sky. Their home is Meteor Falls, which is the location where the original meteoroid shower struck 2,000 years ago. The waterfall inside the cave system in western Huen, the one where Steven and the player meet the Draconid Elder in the Delta episode, is the same waterfall where Rayquaza first descended. The Draconid people built their community around the place where the most important event in their history had happened. Sacred ground in any tradition that uses that concept tends to be where things began. The role of Lore Keeper is the Draconid people's central institutional creation, and its design reflects a sophisticated understanding of what they were trying to preserve. A Lore Keeper is not simply a priest or an oracle or a community leader. The specific function is preservation of knowledge and maintenance of capacity. The knowledge of how to invoke Rayquaza and the physical capability to do so must survive intact until the moment of need. Everything the Lore Keeper does is in service of that preservation function. This creates a role with unusual demands. The Lore Keeper must hold technical knowledge accurately across their entire lifetime and transmit it accurately to their successor. They must maintain the physical artifact required for the invocation. They must understand not just the steps of the ritual, but why each step matters and what the failure of any step would mean. They must be prepared to execute the ritual under conditions of genuine planetary emergency, which is not the same emotional state as rehearsing it in peaceful circumstances. And they must maintain all of this through whatever personal circumstances their life produces, including, in Zinnia's case, the death of the person who was supposed to do it instead. Zinnia's specific situation within the Draconid tradition is one of the more affecting character portraits in the mainline games. She was not designated as Lore Keeper by the tradition. That designation fell to Aster, the girl before her, trained specifically for this cycle of the prophecy. When Aster died, Zinnia stepped into the role she had not been selected for, carrying not just the weight of the responsibility itself, but the weight of doing it in someone else's name. She kept Aster's name with her by giving it to her Whismer, a small and specific act of memorial that the games present without ceremony, allowing the player to understand its significance through context rather than exposition. When Zinnia steals keystones from various trainers throughout Hoenn during the Delta episode, she is acting on her understanding of what Rayquaza's mega evolution requires. When she destroys the link cable that would have allowed Devon Corporation's space warping technology to redirect the asteroid, she is acting on her understanding of what happens if the asteroid is redirected into a parallel world rather than destroyed. Both actions are morally contested within the narrative, and the games do not resolve the contest by simply validating or invalidating Zinnia's Draconid tradition-based judgment. She may be right. She may be applying ancient knowledge correctly to a contemporary crisis, or she may be misapplying it to a situation the tradition was never designed to address. What is not contested is the sincerity and the depth of her commitment. The Draconid tradition gave the Hoenn region 2,000 years of protection through the maintenance of one person's knowledge and capacity. Whether Zinnia is the right person carrying that tradition correctly, the outcome of the Delta episode, Rayquaza's mega evolution, and the destruction of the asteroid is exactly what the tradition was built to produce. Part 6, The Sky Pillar. Sky Pillar is at the far eastern edge of Hoen's water routes, accessible by sea via Route 131, past Pacifidlog Town, and into the more remote sections of the region where the routes thin and the horizon expands. The island it occupies is narrow and rocky, offering the tower little environmental context. You approach across open water, and it simply rises in front of you, tall and ancient looking against the sky. The Draconid people built it. Not recently. The stones are worn, and in places the floors have crumbled to the point where they can no longer be safely crossed at walking speed, suggesting centuries of standing without comprehensive maintenance. The exterior is marked but not decorated in any way that announces significance. The tower does not advertise what it contains. It stands. Inside, the walls carry murals. The Draconid people encoded the history of Rayquaza's interventions, the conditions that preceded them, the specific elements of the invocations that worked, and the outcomes of each descent into the permanent medium of stone and pigment. These are not decorative paintings. They are technical records. The Draconid tradition's recognition that 2,000 years is long enough for even carefully maintained oral transmission to distort, and that what they were preserving was too important to trust to memory alone. The tower's height is itself meaningful. You build things tall when what you are honoring lives above you. Sky Pillar reaches toward the sky where Rayquaza lives, minimizing symbolically and practically the distance between the surface and the edge of the atmosphere. The summit offers unobstructed views in all directions, as close to the upper sky as stone and human labor can reach. In the original Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, Sky Pillar is optional and post-game. The main story of those games resolves the ancient Pokemon conflict through direct confrontation using the red or blue orb, without Rayquaza's involvement. Sky Pillar exists, can be reached after defeating the Elite Four, and holds Rayquaza for those who seek it. But it is not narratively necessary. Rayquaza in Ruby and Sapphire is a bonus, a reward for exploration, a powerful Pokemon waiting for those who go looking. Pokemon Emerald fundamentally changed this by having both Groudon and Kyogre awaken simultaneously. When both villain teams succeed in parallel, neither the blue orb nor the red orb can address both ancient Pokemon at once. The player reaches Sootopolis and finds a standoff with no direct solution. Wallace, the gym leader who knows the legend, takes the player to Sky Pillar. You climb, you reach the summit. Something happens, and Rayquaza flies to Sootopolis and ends the conflict. The Mach Bike sequence on Sky Pillar's crumbling floors has its own relationship to the character of what you are climbing toward. The crumbling tiles cannot be crossed at walking speed. Hesitation causes you to fall through. The only path to the summit requires forward momentum maintained without stopping. Whether or not this was intended as anything beyond a game mechanic, the experience it creates has a particular quality. You cannot approach Rayquaza cautiously. You commit and you go forward. In Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, the tower's significance reaches its fullest expression in the Delta episode. Zinnia narrates the Draconid mural history as you ascend together, layer by layer, so that by the time you reach the summit, you have received the complete context of what is about to happen. The architecture becomes a narrative device, organizing 2,000 years of history in the same sequential structure the murals use, floor by floor, from the beginning to the present crisis at the top. At the summit of Sky Pillar in the Delta episode, with the meteorite in the player's inventory and the asteroid incoming, you battle Rayquaza. Rayquaza consumes the meteorite, charging the Mikado organ with concentrated cosmic energy. Dragon Ascent is taught, and Rayquaza transforms. Then you ride it into space per 7, the Delta episode. The Delta episode of Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire is measured by ambition and narrative consequence, one of the most extraordinary sequences in the history of mainline Pokemon games. A post-game episode, accessible only after entering the Hall of Fame, it contains events of a scale that most main stories would struggle to sustain. The setup begins in the final stages of the main story. The Devon Corporation, the advanced technology company in Rustboro City, has identified a large meteoroid on a collision course with the planet. Their solution, developed using their considerable technological resources and the Moss Deep Space Center's capabilities, is a space warping system capable of redirecting the meteoroid away before impact. This is a rational response to a real threat, using the best tools the modern Pokemon world has available. Zinnia disagrees with the approach, not with the threat assessment, which she has known about for longer than Devon Corporation has, but with the methods. Her objection, stated when she destroys the link cable required for Devon's technology, is rooted in Draconid prophetic understanding of parallel worlds. She believes redirecting the asteroid, rather than destroying it, will push it into a parallel dimension of the Pokemon world, where another version of Hoenn may lack a Rayquaza capable of handling it. She would rather take on the danger directly, using Rayquaza to destroy the asteroid outright, than deflect it towards somewhere that may not have the resources to deal with it. The games do not definitively confirm that Zinnia is right. They do not dismiss her concern either. She has access to knowledge that Devon Corporation scientists do not accumulated across 2,000 years of Draconid tradition, and the treatment of her perspective in the narrative is serious rather than condescending. What is not ambiguous, but is the personal cost she has already paid to be in this position. Aster, the designated lore keeper for this cycle of the prophecy, died. Zinnia carries her name in the name of her Whismer. The fulfillment of the 2,000-year tradition that the Draconid people built fell to someone who was not supposed to be the one to fulfill it, and she has been carrying that weight since. The Climb of Sky Pillar, with Zinnia narrating the mural history, is the Delta episode at its most confident, using the architecture and Zinnia's voice to create something that functions as a complete mythological education. By the time you reach the summit, you know everything you need to know about why this moment matters and what it is the culmination of. The battle with Rayquaza, the meteorite consumed, Dragon Ascent learned, the Mega Evolution achieved. And then the player and Mega Rayquaza ride into space together. The sequence of crossing beyond the atmosphere is visually effective given its hardware constraints. The sky darkens from blue to black. Stars appear in all directions. The planet is below, and ahead, the meteoroid. Mega Rayquaza uses Dragon Ascent on it. The asteroid shatters. The name of the move in this moment carries its full symbolic weight, the dragon ascending to the threat's own level and meeting it there. The move that enables Rayquaza's most powerful form is named after the action of using that form at the highest possible altitude in the most literal possible sense. From the wreckage of the destroyed meteoroid, Deoxys emerges. The extraterrestrial Pokemon, formed from a space virus mutated by a laser beam, was apparently in transit with the meteoroid. It faces the creature that just destroyed its transport and charges. The battle with Deoxys in the vacuum of space is the Delta episode's climactic encounter. It carries the weight of a rivalry established 10 years earlier in the Destiny Deoxys film. The specific territory in which it takes place, space itself, above even the ozone layer Rayquaza normally defends, gives it an appropriate scale. These two creatures have been in conflict before, and the conflict has always been about the boundary between the planet and the space beyond it. The Delta episode takes that conflict to the boundary itself. The player wins. They return to the planet. The asteroid is destroyed. The world is safe. What the Delta episode establishes about Rayquaza, beyond the spectacular imagery, it can survive and operate in actual space. It can mega-evolve without external megastone apparatus. It can destroy an asteroid with a single move. Its conflict with Deoxys is real and ongoing, and the Draconid people's 2,000-year preparation was exactly as necessary as they believed it to be. Part 8. The Mikado Organ. The Mikado Organ is the most consequential piece of specific biological lore in Rayquaza's story, and its consequences extend beyond Rayquaza itself into the entire understood history of Mega Evolution in the Pokemon franchise. When Pokemon X and Y introduced Mega Evolution, the explanatory framework was built around Keystones and Megastones. Every Mega Evolution required both: the trainer's Keystone, the Pokemon's specific Megastone, the resonance between them powered by the emotional bond between trainer and Pokemon. The mechanic was elegant, internally consistent, and it raised questions that X and Y did not fully answer. Where did Megastones come from? Where did the knowledge of Keystone activation originate? Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire answered both questions. Both answers led to Rayquaza. Devon Corporation scientists, studying ancient Draconid records alongside their own biological research, reconstruct the history. Those who saw the way that Rayquaza, possessing its special power, reacted to keystones to transform itself, began research into the subject. This is the origin of Mega Evolution research as a field, observation of Rayquaza. The ancient Draconid accounts of Rayquaza's transformation in response to the Lore Keeper's wish, and the Rainbow Stone were, when later researchers examined them, the first documented instance of what would come to be called Mega Evolution. Rayquaza's transformation 2,000 years ago is the event that subsequent researchers traced backward to as the beginning. Rayquaza was not the discoverer of Mega Evolution. It did not develop the mechanic as a deliberate invention, but it was the first known case, and the existence of that first case is what prompted all subsequent understanding of the phenomenon. The Mikado organ is the biological structure that makes Rayquaza's Mega Evolution possible without an external Megastone. Devon Corporation's scientists describe it precisely: an organ within Rayquaza's body containing the same kind of energy as a Megastone. Not a Megastone itself, not a mineral formation, but a biological structure that has accumulated equivalent energy over hundreds of millions of years of consuming cosmic material through the stratosphere. The name Mikado means emperor in Japanese, and more specifically is a poetic term for the Emperor of Japan, the heavenly sovereign, the king of the sky. The organ allowing Rayquaza's most powerful transformation is named after the concept of divine imperial authority over the heavens. This is deliberate, a connection between Rayquaza's transformative capacity and the Japanese cultural tradition of sky-ruling sovereign power, reinforcing the Japanese dragon lineage already visible in Rayquaza's three-clawed design. The mechanism is specific. As Rayquaza flies through the stratosphere, it consumes small meteoroids. These meteoroids merge with its internal energy, and the Mikado organ accumulates that merged energy. Over time, as the organ fills, it approaches and eventually reaches the threshold that enables transformation. The centuries-long diet of cosmic material is what makes Rayquaza's autonomous mega-evolution possible. It has grown its own megastone internally, from the inside out, through hundreds of millions of years of eating the sky. The competitive consequence of this is the absence of an item slot cost for Mega Rayquaza's transformation. Every other mega-capable Pokémon must hold its specific megastone in battle, sacrificing the held item advantage. Mega Rayquaza holds whatever it wants, while also being capable of transforming into a form with 180 in both attack and a special attack, 115 speed, and the Delta Stream ability that removes the flying type's traditional weaknesses to rock, electric, and ice moves. The word Mikado, the heavenly sovereign, the emperor of the sky, is correct for the organ that produces all of this. What Rayquaza becomes when the Mikado organ is fully charged and Dragon Ascent is expressed is exactly what the title suggests, the sovereign of the heavens, at the fullest possible expression of that sovereignty. Part 9. The Rivalry with Deoxys. The conflict between Rayquaza and Deoxys predates Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire by a decade. It was established in the 7th Pokémon film, Pokémon Destiny Deoxys, released in 2004, and the portrayal there has shaped the understanding of Rayquaza's character in ways that the games, with their necessarily heroic framing of the creature, could not quite replicate. The film opens in the Arctic. A meteoroid impacts. Deoxys emerges from the wreckage and begins reaching towards something specific in the environment. It is searching. It has just arrived on the planet, and it is looking for something. Then Rayquaza descends from the sky and attacks it. The film does not give us Rayquaza's perspective. What we observe is pure behavior, a territorial creature detecting a presence in its domain and responding with immediate force. Deoxys had just arrived and was clearly not attacking anything. The response from Rayquaza was not a considered judgment about threat levels. It was the categorical behavior of a creature that has defined its territory and is enforcing that definition. This characterization is notable for what it does not do. It does not frame Rayquaza's attack as heroic or justified in any way the audience is expected to straightforwardly endorse. Deoxys, in this moment, is a lost creature looking for someone, and Rayquaza attacks it. The film earns the complexity of Rayquaza's nature by not flinching from it. This is a territorial Pokémon, and territorial behavior in nature is not always just. 4 years later, in the film's timeline, a regenerated Deoxys arrives in Larousse City, searching for the companion it lost. Rayquaza follows and resumes the campaign against it, eventually breaking through the energy barrier Deoxys creates around the city. The resolution comes not from Rayquaza reassessing the situation or developing empathy for Deoxys's search, but from Deoxys completing its goal, finding the second Deoxys, reuniting with its companion, the triggering condition for Rayquaza's territorial response no longer being present. Rayquaza returns to the sky. The Pokemon Ranger portrayal in this film is honest in a way that is relatively rare for legendary Pokemon in the animated series. Rayquaza is not a gentle protector. It is not a thoughtful guardian who distinguishes between types of threat. It defends a boundary with complete force and without contextual adjustment. The fact that the boundary it defends has genuine value, that its presence in the ozone layer serves the world, does not soften the specific instance of its aggression against a creature whose purpose was innocent. The Delta episode of Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire gives the rivalry another iteration with different context. The Deoxys that emerges from the wreckage of the destroyed asteroid is not a lost creature searching for a companion. It is in the ruins of its transport, facing the creature that just destroyed it. The confrontation that follows is more genuinely adversarial on both sides, but it still resolves within the same structural frame, Rayquaza defending the boundary between the planet and space, Deoxys on the wrong side of it. The Pokédex entries, noting that Rayquaza's aggression toward Deoxys derives from its natural duty to shield Earth from meteorites and similar threats, acknowledge the territorial logic without quite endorsing its application to every situation. A creature that has been eating meteoroids and defending atmospheric boundaries for hundreds of millions of years does not have a refined capacity for distinguishing between a meteoroid, a space probe, and a living creature that arrived in a meteoroid. It has a trigger and a response. Everything that triggers the response gets the response. That is what Rayquaza is. The power and the limitation are the same fact. Part 10. The Black Rayquaza Pokemon Horizons. The series, beginning in 2023, gave the Pokemon anime its most significant structural change in decades. Ash is no longer the protagonist. Liko and Roy are. And the mystery at the center of Roy's story is an ancient Pokeball his grandfather found, washed up on a beach, which Roy has carried his entire life, believing it contains something extraordinary. Inside the Pokeball is a black Rayquaza, a shiny Rayquaza, jet black where the standard form is deep forest green, the yellow ring markings still running its full length. In the context of Pokemon Horizons, this is not simply a rare color variant. It is a specific individual with a specific century-old history. 100 years before the events of the series, an adventurer named Lucius traveled with 6 Pokemon kept in ancient Pokeballs, collectively called the 6 Heroes. The Black Rayquaza was Lucius's first and primary partner. They traveled together toward a destination the series calls Paradise, a goal whose full meaning had not been revealed as of the most recent episodes. Their partnership was one of genuine companionship, not the trainer owns Pokemon dynamic of competitive play, not the ancient covenant of the Draconid tradition. They traveled together as companions towards something that mattered to both of them. At some point, Following the events of Lucius's travels, the black Rayquaza returned to its ancient Pokeball. The Pokeball ended up in the ocean. After some period of time, possibly the full century, it washed up on a Kanto beach. A man found it, could not open it, and eventually gave it to his grandson. His grandson is Roy. The Pokeball opens in Pokemon Horizons, it's episode 6, during a crisis. Liko is in danger, Roy is in danger, and simultaneously the ancient Pokeball and Liko's pendant begin to glow in response to each other. The Pokeball opens. The black Rayquaza erupts from it, fires a Draco meteor that drives the explorers away, glances at Liko, and flies into the sky before Roy can do anything. Roy's response defines his character more completely than any other early episode moment. He is not frustrated. He is not primarily struck by the power of what happened. He is convinced the Rayquaza was testing him, assessing whether he is someone worth partnering with, and he was found not yet ready. His goal, from that moment, is to become someone the black Rayquaza would choose to travel with. This is an unusual motivation for a Pokemon protagonist. Not catching the most powerful Pokemon because it is powerful, not fulfilling a destiny because he was born to it, but undertaking to become a specific kind of person that a specific individual with standards and judgment has set as its criteria for partnership. The journey is not a quest for the Rayquaza. It is a project of self-development aimed at being worthy of it. Later episodes clarify that the black Rayquaza was not left in the Pokeball to await a specific bloodline. It was left to find a trainer capable of achieving Lucius's goals. Roy's possession of the Pokeball was the necessary initial condition. What he does with it, whether he grows into the kind of person the Rayquaza is looking for, is the open question that drives his arc. The connection to Liko runs through her descent from Ristal, a woman who encountered Lucius and whose Pokemon Terrapagos was once protected by Lucius and the black Rayquaza. The resonance between Liko's pendant and the ancient Pokeball is the expression of that historical connection, a link between her lineage and the trainer the Rayquaza once knew. The glance Rayquaza gives Liko after emerging is, in this reading, a recognition, something familiar, connected to someone it once traveled beside. The mega evolution the black Rayquaza eventually undergoes in Horizons incorporates visual elements from the Terrastal mechanic of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, a crystalline texture overlaying the transformed form. This creates a visual synthesis of two different generational aesthetics in a single creature and a single moment. The first Pokemon to mega evolve, doing it again in visual language that acknowledges everything that followed from its example. Time and the franchise's own history collapsing into one image. The larger story of Pokemon Horizons and what Lucius sought remains unfinished, but what the black Rayquaza thread has already produced is something the franchise has not previously achieved with this character. A Rayquaza with an ongoing developing relationship to a human being built episode by episode through demonstrated growth, where the Pokemon is an active participant with standards and judgment, rather than a force to be encountered and caught. Part 11. Too powerful to exist. No Pokemon in the history of organized competitive play required the structural response that Mega Rayquaza required. The Smogon tier system organizes Pokemon into competitive tiers based on usage rates and power assessments. At the apex is the Ubers tier, historically a combination of competitive playground for the most powerful Pokemon and ban list for Pokemon deemed too strong for OU. Things went into Ubers. Nothing had ever been banned from Ubers. Ubers was understood as the end of the line. Base Rayquaza was present in Ubers without creating exceptional problems. Its 680 base stat total, the 150-150 offensive split, access to Dragon Dance, Draco Meteor, V-Create, Earthquake, Extreme Speed, and Dragon Ascent made it one of the more powerful Pokemon in the tier, manageable within the existing competitive landscape. Mega Rayquaza broke this entirely. The base stat increased from 680 to 780, with attack rising to 180, and special attack to 180, speed to 115, combined with Delta Stream as its ability, created offensive numbers that the Ubers tier's defensive options could not reliably absorb. But the numbers alone were not the primary problem. The primary problem was the combination of those numbers with the absence of an item slot cost. Every other mega-capable Pokemon must hold its specific Mega Stone in battle to transform. This item slot sacrifice is a significant constraint. The held item is one of the most strategically consequential decisions in team building, and items like Life Orb for damage amplification, Choice Band or Specs for offensive boosts, or Leftovers for passive recovery can completely change a Pokemon's role and effectiveness. Mega Rayquaza faces no such trade-off. It can hold a Life Orb while also being capable of transforming into a form with 180-180 attacking stats and an ability eliminating its most significant defensive vulnerabilities. Smogon determined that Mega Rayquaza was broken. It centralized team building in ways that reduced strategic diversity and player skill expression to unacceptable degrees. The response was an unprecedented ban from Ubers. The problem: nothing had ever been banned from Ubers. Banning something from Ubers created an immediate logical problem about what Ubers was for. Smogon addressed this by formally redefining Ubers as an actual competitive tier governed by balance principles, and then creating a new tier above it for what was banned from it. That tier is Sir Anything Goes. The name says everything. No banned Pokemon, no banned moves, no clauses except the endless battle clause. There are no restrictions in Anything Goes. If you want to use Mega Rayquaza alongside 6 other Pokemon, each individually banned from every other tier, you can. Anything goes. Mega Rayquaza is why this tier had to be invented. Its existence was so far outside what any existing structure could accommodate that the competitive community built a new category around it. This is, in a franchise played competitively for decades by thousands of players, an extraordinary statement about what Mega Rayquaza is. Not just the strongest Pokemon in a tier, but the Pokemon whose existence made a new tier necessary. The parallel to the in-universe lore is available to anyone who looks. A creature that has lived in a region by itself because nothing else can survive at that altitude, doing a job nothing else can perform, operating on a scale the ordinary structures of the world cannot contain. In competitive Pokemon, a tier exists specifically because no existing structure could hold what Rayquaza can do. The sky, in both the fictional mythology and the competitive metagame, belongs to it. Part 12. Why Rayquaza Endures. The question is worth asking after more than 20 years. Why has Rayquaza held its cultural position? The franchise has introduced several hundred new legendary and mythical Pokemon since Generation 3, many of them genuinely beloved. Some have faded. Why did Rayquaza not? The design is part of the answer. The long forest green serpentine body, the yellow ring markings, the horned head, the fin structures, established in 2002 and maintained without significant revision across all subsequent appearances. The design was right the first time, and consistency across 20 years of media gives it accumulated visual authority that newer designs cannot shortcut their way to. But design alone does not explain endurance in a franchise with hundreds of excellent designs. What Rayquaza has that most others do not is accumulated narrative depth across multiple distinct media and game generations, each adding something substantive. Ruby and Sapphire introduced it as a powerful mystery at the most remote accessible location in Hoenn. Emerald made it the resolution of the main story conflict, the thing the world needed when nothing else could address the crisis. Destiny Deoxys gave it animated screen presence that communicated its territorial character and its scale to millions of viewers before they ever played the games. Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire gave it the most elaborately constructed mythological framework of any legendary Pokemon in the franchise's history at that point, revealing the origin of Mega Evolution, providing the complete Draconid backstory, and delivering the spaceflight sequence. And Pokemon Horizons has done something none of those previous entries managed, given Rayquaza an ongoing developing relationship with a human character being built across episodes through demonstrated growth. The competitive history adds a dimension that operates independently of any of this. Very few Pokemon have actually changed the structure of organized competitive play in permanent ways. Mega Rayquaza is one of them. The creation of the Anything Goes tier is a permanent part of competitive Pokemon history, and Mega Rayquaza is the reason it exists. That kind of structural impact gets referenced and discussed for decades, regardless of what happens to the metagame around it. There is something worth noting about how Rayquaza fits the franchise's broader thematic concerns. Pokemon has always been interested in the relationship between human civilization and the natural world, in the question of how people relate to forces larger than themselves. Rayquaza sits in an unusual position within this. It is not a product of human ambition, not a consequence of human excess, not something humans could control or exploit, even with their most advanced technology. It predates human civilization by hundreds of millions of years. It will presumably outlast it, and it responds to human need, not through any human-developed mechanism, but through the sincere invocation of a specific form of contact maintained through centuries of careful preservation. The Draconid tradition is not science. It is not technology. It is an institution built around the recognition that reaching something genuinely powerful and genuinely remote requires specific knowledge maintained with patience over enormous spans of time, and that the knowledge itself is not enough. It must be paired with genuine need, performed at the right moment, by someone who has carried it faithfully enough to carry it correctly. 2,000 years of a small tribe doing exactly that, building a tower, training lore keepers, keeping the story alive through 40 or 50 or 60 generations of transmission. And when the asteroid came, the chain held. That is what the endurance of the Rayquaza narrative is built on. Not just the power and the spectacle, though those are real, but the smaller story embedded inside the large one. The story of people who looked up and decided that maintaining a relationship with what they saw up there was the most important thing they could do, and who did it for 2,000 years without knowing exactly when the effort would be required. And when it was required, the thing they had been reaching toward came down. Rayquaza has been called the beginning of all things, in the context of mega evolution, the Dragon Lord by the people who spent the longest time understanding it, the sky-high Pokemon by the academic taxonomy of the Pokédex, the reason anything goes exists by every competitive player who has ever needed to account for it. The thing in the ancient Pokeball by a boy still learning who he needs to become. Every one of those titles fits. Every layer of this lore rewards the time it takes to trace. And there is probably more to come as the story of the Black Rayquaza and Lucius continues to unfold in Pokemon Horizons, and as the franchise keeps adding to a mythology that has proven across 20 years that it is built to last. That is all of it, or as much as currently exists to tell. If you made it through this entire video, you are exactly who this channel is for. Drop a comment telling me which part of the lore hit you the hardest. Whether it was the Draconid tradition, the Delta episode spaceflight, the competitive ban, and the anything goes tier, or the ongoing story of the Black Rayquaza in Pokemon Horizons, I read every comment, and I genuinely want to know what stayed with you. If you are not subscribed yet, now is the time. Hit subscribe and the notification bell, because every video we make goes this deep, and there is considerably more of it coming. If the video was worth your time, a like tells the algorithm that other people would want to find it. That is the simplest thing you can do to help this reach further. Until next time, rest well and look up sometimes at the part of the sky that is too high to see anything in clearly, at the edge of the atmosphere where the blue starts to thin toward black. You never know what might be up there. Expanded Deep Dive, the Weather Trio in full context. To fully appreciate what Rayquaza represents, it helps to understand the complete cosmological architecture of the Weather Trio, because Rayquaza does not exist in isolation. It exists in explicit relationship to Groudon and Kyogre, and the three of them together form a system that the lore of the Pokemon world treats as foundational to the physical structure of the Hoenn region, and by extension, to the broader ecology of the planet. The term Weather Trio is somewhat misleading. Yes, all three Pokemon are associated with atmospheric and geological conditions, and all three have abilities that influence the weather mechanic in competitive play. But calling them the Weather Trio undersells the scope of what they actually represent in the lore. A more accurate framing might be the Elemental Domain Trio, or more precisely, the three Pokemon who govern the three fundamental physical systems of a habitable planet: the lithosphere, the hydrosphere, and the atmosphere. Groudon governs the lithosphere, the crust and upper mantle of the planet, the solid surface on which all terrestrial life depends. Its ability to create land, to trigger volcanic activity, to heat and expand continental surfaces, makes it the master of the geological foundation of the world. Everything that grows on land, everything that lives on land, everything built on land exists because the lithosphere provides a stable enough surface to support it. Groudon, in the logic of the Pokemon world, is the process that creates and maintains that surface. Kyogre governs the hydrosphere, the oceans, and their weather-generating capacity, the water cycle that distributes rainfall across the planet and makes terrestrial life possible. Its ability to summon rain and expand ocean coverage, to call up waves and control the distribution of water, makes it the master of the system that moderates climate and provides fresh water to the entire planet. Every river, every freshwater lake, every rainfall, every cloud is part of the system that Kyogre, in the logic of the Pokemon world, governs. Rayquaza governs the atmosphere, not just the weather that Groudon and Kyogre generate and fight over, but the upper atmosphere itself, the ozone layer that shields the surface from solar radiation and marks the outermost boundary of the planetary system. Its airlock ability in base form, which prevents weather from functioning at all, is the atmospheric equivalent of shutting off both of the other systems temporarily. Its delta stream ability in megaform, which creates its own weather condition and overrides all others, is the expression of full atmospheric sovereignty. When Rayquaza is at full power, the atmosphere answers to it and nothing else. This structure, three creatures governing three fundamental planetary systems, with the atmospheric one capable of overriding both of the others, creates a specific hierarchical logic. Groudon and Kyogre are equals in conflict. Neither can permanently dominate the other. Their elemental domains are in fundamental tension, and the resulting conflict is what produces the dynamic geology and climate of the Hoenn region. But Rayquaza is not their equal. It is above both of them in the hierarchy, capable of shutting down both of their systems simultaneously, capable of overpowering both of them in physical conflict even in their most powerful primal states. The parallel to the Ziz Behemoth Leviathan triad from Hebrew mythology is most visible in this hierarchical structure. In those traditions, the three primordial beasts are not equals either. The sky beast, the Ziz, occupies the apex position, governing the domain that encompasses the other two, potentially capable of containing them if necessary. The land beast and the sea beast fight their own conflicts, but the sky beast is above that conflict in both the literal and structural sense. What makes the weather trio distinctive compared to other legendary trios in the franchise is the explicitness with which the lore establishes the power hierarchy. Most legendary trios, whether the Birds of Kanto or the legendaries of Johto or the creation trio of Sinnoh, have their hierarchical relationships implied or partially established, rather than shown in direct conflict with a clear outcome. The Weather Trio is different because the games, particularly Emerald and Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, show the hierarchy in operation. Groudon and Kyogre fight to a standstill when both are at full power, and Rayquaza resolves the standstill by overpowering both of them. The hierarchy is not abstract. It is demonstrated. This has implications for how Rayquaza's moral status in the Pokemon world is understood, The creature that keeps the most fundamental systems of the planet in balance is not a benevolent overseer in the conventional sense. It is not managing the system through wisdom or diplomacy. It is keeping it in balance through the fact of its existence and the willingness to apply overwhelming force when the balance is disrupted. The peace of the system is real, but it is founded on power rather than on principle. This is a more honest treatment of how balance works in nature than most narratives offer. Real ecological balance is not maintained by anything that consciously chooses balance as a goal. It is maintained by the relationships between competing forces, with any individual organism pursuing its own interests rather than the system's health. Rayquaza does not want balance. It wants its territory intact and its world not destroyed. The fact that these personal, territorial, and preservationist drives produce balance for everyone else is a byproduct, not an intention. The Draconid people understood this, which is part of why their relationship with Rayquaza took the specific institutional form it did. They did not build a temple to a god who loved them. They built a mechanism for reaching something that, when properly invoked in the right circumstances, would do what its own nature compelled it to do, and that what its nature compelled it to do happened to be what the world needed. The invocation is not prayer to a caring deity. It is the correct activation of a specific mechanism in a specific way. The lore keeper tradition is less like a priesthood and more like the team of people who maintain the knowledge of how to operate critical infrastructure. That framing makes the tradition more extraordinary, not less. Maintaining critical infrastructure knowledge across 2,000 years through societal changes and population losses and the attrition of time without the infrastructure itself being directly accessible for practice or testing is a remarkable institutional achievement. The Draconid people did not get to test whether the ritual still worked between uses. They just had to keep the knowledge intact and trust that when the moment came, it would still function. It did. The aesthetics of Rayquaza design details. The visual design of Rayquaza rewards detailed examination because every element of it is doing specific work in establishing what kind of creature this is, where it lives, and what role it plays. The body is the most immediately striking element, 7 meters of serpentine length, in base form, tapering from the wide-jawed head through the main body to the finned tail. The body has no wings in any conventional sense. There is no wingspan to generate lift in the aerodynamic meaning. What it has is fins, structural elements along the sides of its body and at the tail that provide stability and directional control in the upper atmospheric environment where it lives, where conventional aerodynamics apply differently than at sea level. The fins are not designed for the physics of dense lower atmosphere. They are designed for the thin upper stratosphere, where subtle adjustments to a long body moving at speed produce meaningful changes in trajectory. The green of the base form is a deep, slightly muted forest green, rather than the bright primary green of something like a tropius, or the yellow-green of vegetation-inspired designs. The depth of the color and its specific shades suggest age, something that has been in this environment for a very long time, absorbing the atmospheric chemistry of the ozone layer and the cosmic material of meteoroids, both of which would leave chemical traces on the organism's surface over geological time. The yellow ring markings are the design element most often cited in connection with the Nazca Line's parallel, and they are also the element that most immediately distinguishes Rayquaza's silhouette from other serpentine Pokémon. They are not scales, not simple stripes, but interconnected rings, each complete in itself, linked to the next along the body's length. The pattern has a geometric quality that sits interestingly between organic and constructed, as though something that started as biological pigmentation has been regularized by the extreme consistency of the environment Rayquaza has inhabited. Hundreds of millions of years of the same conditions might plausibly produce very regular patterns in a creature's markings. The head is elongated, with a lower jaw that the Pokédex and visual design descriptions note as pink-lined, prominent fangs in the upper jaw, and two large, flat, horn-like structures extending backward from the skull, with two shorter ones along the jawline. The yellow eyes are notably small relative to the head, set into position in a way that suggests lateral rather than forward-facing vision, appropriate for a creature that needs to maintain awareness of its wide atmospheric environment rather than focus narrowly on a small area in front of it. The two small front limbs, each with 3 clawed hands, are unusual for a serpentine body plan and are the element that most specifically marks Rayquaza in the Japanese dragon tradition, where the 3 claws are characteristic. They do not appear functional for locomotion in any obvious sense given the serpentine body, but in the context of the Japanese dragon tradition, they are the physical marker of a specific kind of celestial entity. They communicate lineage and power type rather than practical biomechanics. Mega Rayquaza transforms this base design in ways that amplify the cosmic dimension. The body extends further. The fins become luminous filaments, glowing with energy, giving Mega Rayquaza a triangular profile in flight that is explicitly referenced in the game descriptions. The yellow ring markings are replaced by golden glowing orbs, positioned where the rings were, radiating light. The lower jaw gains the distinctive delta shape that appears throughout the Delta episode's iconography. The eyes change to yellow pupils on red irises, a shift from the cool detachment of the base form's small yellow eyes to something more intense and present. The delta symbol on Mega Rayquaza's head is worth noting specifically. In mathematics and science, the delta symbol denotes change and difference, often specifically the difference between two states or the rate of change of a quantity. In the context of the delta episode, the symbol connects Mega Rayquaza to the episode's broader theme of transformation and the crossing of thresholds. The creature that is itself a threshold between the planet and space, in its most powerful form, bears the mark of transition on its face. The shiny variant of Rayquaza, which is the black Rayquaza of Pokémon Horizons, transforms the deep forest green to jet black. The yellow ring markings remain, creating a high contrast pattern against the dark body. The effect is to strip away the naturalistic quality of the base form and produce something more severe and austere, more visually associated with the cosmic darkness of space than with the biological environment of the atmosphere. A green Rayquaza looks like a creature that has adapted to its environment. A black Rayquaza looks like a creature that has been somewhere beyond its environment and carries the mark of that. The Pokemon Horizons characterization of the Black Rayquaza as a creature that has been sealed in a Pokeball at the bottom of the ocean for roughly a century, waiting for the right trainer, takes on additional visual resonance with the black coloring. Something that has been waiting in darkness, in the deep ocean, out of the sky where it belongs, preserved in an ancient Pokeball. The visual language of the shiny form supports the narrative context. Rayquaza across all game appearances. Rayquaza's appearances across the mainline game series trace an interesting arc from optional post-game bonus to central narrative figure, reflecting the franchise's increasing confidence in using its most powerful legendary Pokemon as story engines, rather than simply as rare catch rewards. In Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, the original games where Rayquaza debuted in 2002, it appears exclusively at the top of Sky Pillar as an optional post-game catch. The player deals with Kyogre or Groudon through the main story using the Cave of Origin and the red or blue orb, and only after defeating the Elite Four and entering the Hall of Fame can they access the rocks blocking the island where Sky Pillar stands. The tower's crumbling floors require the Mach Bike for full navigation, and Rayquaza sits at level 70 at the summit. It is one of the stronger optional catches in the game, but completely disconnected from the main story. This is the version of Rayquaza that many players of that generation encountered first, and the contrast with how it would eventually be presented in later games is stark. In Ruby and Sapphire, Rayquaza has no narrative weight. It is a very powerful legendary Pokemon in a part of the game you visit after the story is over. The Pokédex entry establishes its mythology, but the game does not invite you to engage with that mythology. You go, you find it, you catch it, or you do not. Pokemon Emerald in 2004 fundamentally transformed this. The scenario where both villain teams succeed simultaneously, creating a crisis that neither orb can address, required a third solution. The construction of that solution around Sky Pillar and Rayquaza gave the creature a narrative role commensurate with its power for the first time in any game. You need Rayquaza. The world needs Rayquaza. The story does not resolve without going to the tower and doing what the Draconid tradition says to do, even though the game does not yet fully explain the Draconid tradition. The emotional impact of the Emerald sequence is partly a function of the Mach Bike ascent under crisis conditions. You know what is happening in Sutopolis. You know the weather is tearing the city apart. You are climbing this crumbling tower under time pressure of a sort, even though the game does not impose a literal timer. The urgency is narrative rather than mechanical, and the minimal rendering of what happens when you reach the top. No full cutscene, just the knowledge that Rayquaza descended and the weather cleared trusts the player's imagination to fill in what that must have looked like. Heart Gold and Soul Silver, the 2009 remakes of Gold and Silver, included Rayquaza as a transferable migrated Pokemon and also made it available through a specific Link event, keeping it in the Generations ecosystem without giving it a new story role. Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire in 2014 are the definitive Rayquaza games in terms of lore. The Delta episode, as discussed at length above, provides the complete mythological context that Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald had only gestured toward, and the spaceflight sequence is the most spectacular moment in any mainline game's use of a legendary Pokemon up to that point. Rayquaza in ORAS is no longer just powerful. It is historically significant, cosmologically fundamental, the origin of Mega Evolution, and the creature that a small tribe of people spent 2,000 years preparing to summon at exactly the right moment. Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, the 2021 remakes of Diamond and Pearl for Nintendo Switch, included Rayquaza as an event Pokemon accessible through a specific mystery gift distribution, maintaining its presence in the contemporary generation without adding new story material. Pokemon Legends Arceus, the 2022 open-world historical Pokemon game set in ancient Sinnoh, did not include Rayquaza in its main content, but the franchise's ongoing expansion of its Pokemon Legends line has created interest in what a historical Hoenn treatment, and by extension, a historical Rayquaza treatment, might look like. In spin-off titles, Rayquaza has appeared in Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, Explorers of Time, Darkness, and Sky, where it serves as the antagonist of the game's legendary chapters and is eventually befriended by the player. Its role in that game makes it one of the few legendary Pokemon to serve as an antagonist and then shift to a supportive relationship across the same game, and the presentation of its power in the Mystery Dungeon context, governing the highest reaches of the sky above the Mystery Dungeon world, is consistent with its mainline characterization. Super Smash Bros. Brawl's Subspace Emissary Adventure mode used Rayquaza as a boss character, one of the few legendary Pokemon to receive that treatment in the Smash series. The Smash appearance introduced Rayquaza to an audience that may not have been deeply familiar with the mainline games, and the boss fight presentation emphasized the creature's scale and raw power in ways that complemented the mainline game's more narrative approach. Pokemon Go's inclusion of Rayquaza and eventually Mega Rayquaza as raid bosses brought the creature to one of the franchise's largest player populations. The mechanics for Mega Rayquaza in Pokemon Go specifically preserve the Dragon Ascent requirement, with trainers needing to use a meteorite item to teach the move before accessing the Mega Evolution. This fidelity to the mainline lore in a mobile game context demonstrates the franchise's recognition of Rayquaza's specific mythological requirements as essential rather than optional. Across all of these appearances, what remains consistent is the basic characterization established in the Pokédex entries in the Ruby and Sapphire games, something ancient, powerful, and remote that descends when the world needs it and returns to the sky when it has done what it came to do. The lore accumulates, the narrative contexts diversify, the specific stories change, but the core nature is preserved. The legacy of Mega Rayquaza. Specifically, Mega Rayquaza deserves its own section in any comprehensive discussion of Rayquaza's legacy, because its introduction in 2014 added a dimension to the character's cultural presence that the base form, powerful as it was, could not provide by itself. Historical significance in the competitive community of a kind that only a handful of developments across the franchise's history have achieved. When Game Freak designed Mega Rayquaza, they were working within the constraints established by Mega Evolution's existing framework. The Mega Stone requirement, the item slot cost, the single Mega Evolution per battle rule. Every other Mega Evolution in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire followed these constraints. Mega Rayquaza's exemption from the Megastone requirement was not an accident or an oversight. It was a deliberate design choice reflecting the lore. The Mikado organ replaces the Megastone, so Rayquaza does not need an external one. The lore justification is clean and elegant. The gameplay consequence was an unintended design space that the competitive community had to navigate in real time after the games released. The early analysis in November and December 2014, when Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire were newly available, was not immediately certain about Mega Rayquaza's tier placement. There was discussion about whether the existing Uber's metagame could adapt around it, whether specific defensive cores could be constructed to handle it, whether the 95 speed of base Rayquaza, which became 115 in Mega form, was fast enough to be a significant issue given what the Uber's tier contained. The initial impression was that it was very strong but potentially manageable. That impression did not survive contact with actual competitive play. The specifics of the matchup calculations, combined with the item slot freedom and the Delta Stream ability, created a combination that the Uber's tier's existing team structures could not reliably address. The damage numbers from Life Orb Dragon Ascent were too high. The speed at 115 was fast enough to outpace the majority of common Uber's threats, and Delta Stream's removal of the flying type's weaknesses meant that the traditional counterplay to flying type attackers, specifically Rock Slide, Thunderbolt, and Ice Beam, did not work against Mega Rayquaza in the way they worked against other flying types. The decision to ban Mega Rayquaza from Ubers was made by the Smogon Council in late 2014, roughly within weeks of the game's release. The speed of the decision reflects how quickly the analysis converged on the same conclusion. The creation of Anything Goes as a tier to house what was banned from Ubers was not immediate. There was initial discussion about what to do with the banned Pokemon and whether simply having a banned Pokemon with nowhere to go was acceptable for a community-organized competitive format. The decision to formalize Anything Goes as a tier with the explicit statement that it has no restrictions beyond Endless Battle Clause was the community's answer to the question of how to handle something too powerful for even the most powerful existing tier. Anything Goes has since developed into its own competitive format with its own metagame dynamics, its own set of top threats and viable strategies, and its own player community. Mega Rayquaza is consistently among the most influential Pokemon in Anything Goes, though the format's lack of restrictions means that the counterplay options available there are broader than in any other tier. The format is not well balanced in the conventional competitive sense, but it provides a context where Mega Rayquaza can be used and competed against by players who want to engage with it. The broader legacy of the Mega Rayquaza situation is that it forced the competitive Pokemon community to articulate principles about what makes a Pokemon too powerful for a given tier and what to do when the existing tier structure cannot accommodate something. These articulated principles have been referenced and applied in subsequent discussions about other problematic Pokemon, giving the Mega Rayquaza episode a lasting influence on competitive discourse beyond the specific case. It also produced one of the more interesting instances of game design and competitive community interaction in the franchise's history. Game Freak designed Mega Rayquaza with the lore-justified Mega Stone exemption, creating a competitive entity that the game's official formats handle through simple tier restrictions in the video game championship format. The competitive community organized outside of official formats had to develop its own response, which ended up creating a new tier that has persisted as part of the competitive landscape. The interaction between lore-motivated game design and competitive community response produced something neither party alone would have created. This is, in a small way, the same dynamic that the Draconid people navigated on a larger scale, a situation that existing frameworks could not handle, addressed by building new frameworks specifically for it. The people working on competitive Pokemon balance and the people building a tower to reach a sky creature were engaged in their respective contexts in the same essential project, creating the right structure to accommodate something that does not fit existing structures. Closing reflection. What makes Rayquaza resonate? Great mythology, whether from ancient human cultures or from contemporary franchise storytelling, tends to have a quality of inevitability about it when done well. The stories feel as though they could not have been otherwise, as though the elements belong together in ways that seem less like invention and more like discovery. Rayquaza has this quality across the full breadth of its lore. The connection between its ozone layer habitat and its diet of meteoroids and its role as planetary defender feels not designed but discovered, as though the logic was always present and the game designers simply followed it to where it led. The parallel between the Draconid tradition's ritual invocation and the general human cross-cultural practice of maintaining specific knowledge for reaching things that are remote and powerful feels not like world-building convenience, but like the natural expression of how humans have always related to things much larger than themselves. The relationship between Rayquaza's Mega Evolution and the origin of the entire Mega Evolution mechanic feels not like retroactive continuity, but like the story that was always underneath the mechanic, waiting to be told. This sense of inevitability is the hallmark of mythology that has been built carefully and consistently over time, rather than assembled hastily. Rayquaza's mythology has been built across 20 years, through Ruby and Sapphire and Emerald and the Destiny Deoxys film, and Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire and Pokemon Horizons, by teams of people working on different projects at different times who all took the existing lore seriously and added to it in ways that respected what came before. The result is a character that has accumulated the kind of narrative weight that cannot be manufactured in a single game or season. It has to be earned through consistent and thoughtful development over time, and Rayquaza has earned it. The Black Rayquaza story in Pokemon Horizons is, in this context, not an endpoint, but a continuation. The franchise is still adding to the mythology, still finding new angles from which to understand what this creature is and what it means. 100 years ago, someone chose to travel with it. Today, a boy is trying to become someone it will choose to travel with. These are different stories about the same entity, adding different dimensions to the same character. All of it fitting together because the character at the center of it is coherent enough and deep enough to support all of them simultaneously. Rayquaza has been alive for hundreds of millions of years, according to its own Pokédex. It has been in the franchise for 20 plus years, which is a very small fraction of that. And if the quality and consistency of the storytelling around it continues at the level the franchise has demonstrated so far, there is plenty of time left for it to become even more fully itself. The sky above you is a long way up, and whatever is circling up there in the thin, cold air at the edge of the atmosphere has been doing it since before the land below you had its present shape. That is worth knowing about. The ozone layer, as sacred space one of the quieter but more resonant aspects of Rayquaza's lore, is the specific choice of the ozone layer as its habitat. This is not an obvious choice for a dragon-type legendary Pokémon. Most powerful legendary Pokémon in the franchise inhabit dramatic physical spaces that communicate their power clearly. The top of mountains, the depths of the ocean, the interior of volcanoes, caves at the edge of the world. These are places humans can reach, difficult or dangerous though they may be, and the Pokémon that inhabit them are findable, visitable, confrontable. The ozone layer is different in kind, not just in degree. Humans, in the Pokémon world, can climb mountains and dive to ocean floors. They cannot naturally visit the ozone layer. It is not a place that exists on any in-game map in any reachable form. Sky Pillar reaches toward it and does not arrive there. The Delta episode sends the player character into the area via Mega Rayquaza's back, but that is transportation rather than independent access. The ozone layer is, in the geography of the Pokémon world, a location that exists and is real and contains a specific thing, but is functionally unreachable by any ordinary means. This makes Rayquaza unique among catchable, legendary Pokémon in a way that the game mechanics smooth over, but the lore does not. You can go to Sky Pillar and catch Rayquaza, but the Rayquaza you catch was already on Sky Pillar at that moment, not in its natural habitat. The natural habitat of Rayquaza, the place where it has lived for hundreds of millions of years, and to which it returns after each descent, is permanently out of reach. You can meet Rayquaza on its terms when it has come down. You cannot go to it. This inaccessibility gives the ozone layer a quality of sacred space in the structure of the Pokémon world, not sacred in a formal religious sense, though the Draconid tradition approaches it that way. Sacred in the sense of set apart, designated as different in kind from accessible space, reserved for something whose nature the accessible world cannot contain. The ozone layer is where the world's guardian lives, and the world's guardian lives there precisely because that altitude is incompatible with ordinary life. The separation is not incidental to the role. It is the role. Rayquaza guards the boundary between the planet and space by inhabiting that boundary, by being the only living thing at that altitude, by making the boundary itself a habitat. There is something in this that connects to a broader pattern in how mythology structures relationships between humans and the divine. Sacred spaces in religious traditions across human cultures tend to be marked by the difficulty or impossibility of ordinary access. Mountaintops, islands, depths of the ocean, desert wildernesses. The difficulty of reaching them is not just a practical fact, but a symbolic one. The thing that lives there is not the same kind of thing as what lives in the accessible world, and the difficulty of access is how the structure of the world communicates that distinction. Rayquaza's habitat communicates this distinction very precisely. The ozone layer is the most inaccessible inhabited space in the Pokemon world. The thing that lives there is the most powerful creature in the system of creatures that govern the physical world. The relationship between location and power is not accidental. The Pokemon world, in placing its most fundamental guardian at its most inaccessible altitude, is making a structural argument that the thing responsible for maintaining the balance of the world's basic systems should be as remote from interference as possible, should live in a place that ordinary events cannot reach, should descend only when the need is genuine and urgent and impossible to address any other way. This is also the structural reason why the Draconid people's ritual works the way it does. If Rayquaza could be reached through ordinary means, through climbing or flying or swimming to the right location, then the ritual would be unnecessary. The ritual is necessary precisely because Rayquaza cannot be reached through ordinary means. The knowledge of how to invoke its descent from the ozone layer is valuable specifically because the ozone layer itself is not accessible. The Draconid tradition is the human world's workaround for the inaccessibility of the most important thing in the sky. This gives the lore keeper's knowledge a different quality from ordinary institutional knowledge. It is not knowledge about how to reach a place that exists on a map. It is knowledge about how to communicate across a gap that no physical movement can cross. The invocation is less like navigation and more like signal, the right signal, transmitted in the right way, capable of reaching something at an altitude that receives very few signals from the surface. That the signal takes the form of a wish is in this light deeply appropriate. A wish is the most minimal possible form of communication, stripped of any pretension to instrumentality or leverage. You cannot force something at that altitude to respond through any application of power. You cannot reach it with any tool. You can only express genuine need in the correct form and wait to see if it responds. The wish is the acknowledging of dependence, the acknowledgement that you cannot solve this yourself, that you need something you cannot compel, and that your only option is to ask correctly and hope the thing you are asking has the nature to respond. Rayquaza, as characterized by the never-ending appetite for doing what is right, apparently does. The name Rayquaza, etymology and significance. The name Rayquaza, while it sounds invented rather than derived from obvious sources, actually contains at least two clear etymological threads that connect it to its design and role. The most widely noted component is the word quasar. A quasar, in real-world astronomy, is a type of extremely luminous, active galactic nucleus, the most energetic and distant objects observable in the universe, powered by supermassive black holes, consuming enormous quantities of matter and releasing the energy as light across the electromagnetic spectrum. Quasars are visible from billions of light years away and were among the brightest objects in the early universe. They are, in the most literal sense, cosmic luminosity at maximum expression. The connection between Rayquaza and a quasar is thematic rather than literal. Both are associated with the emission of enormous energy from a cosmic context. Both are associated with the consumption of cosmic material as a power source, and both exist at scales that are difficult to process from ordinary human perspective. Rayquaza eating meteoroids in the ozone layer and emitting the energy as the luminosity that makes it look like a meteor in flight is, at a small scale, the same basic physics as a quasar emitting light from the consumption of infalling matter. The ray component of the name is more directly visual, rays of light, specifically the cosmic rays and solar radiation that the ozone layer exists to attenuate. Rayquaza lives in the ozone layer, which is the layer of the atmosphere that blocks the most harmful rays of solar radiation from reaching the surface. The creature whose name begins with Ray lives in the region of the atmosphere most associated with the interception of rays. The Japanese name, Rayquaza, is analyzed by some researchers as potentially derived from Retsukuza, a combination but suggesting intense sky seat or intense sky dragon, drawing on Japanese words for intense or violent, sky or air, and a counter for creatures. The Q component specifically connects to ku, meaning sky in Japanese, and is also present in words for empty or void, suggesting both the physical sky and the emptiness of space beyond it. A creature whose name in Japanese can be read as the entity of the intense sky or the sovereign of the void above, living at the edge of the atmosphere where the sky transitions to the void of space, is named with perfect appropriateness. The combination of these etymological threads, cosmic luminosity from quasar, atmospheric rays from the ozone context, and Japanese sky void from the original name, produces a name that works simultaneously as a scientific reference, a visual description, and a cosmological position statement. The creature at the edge of the atmosphere, where rays of cosmic energy enter the planet's sphere and are partially absorbed, whose own body emits energy that makes it look like those same rays, whose name references the most extreme expression of cosmic energy emission that astronomy has identified. Game Freak's naming conventions for legendary Pokémon often reward this kind of multi-layered analysis, and Rayquaza is one of the more richly constructed examples. Rayquaza's relationship with time. There is a dimension of Rayquaza's existence that the explicit lore does not fully address, but which is implied by the accumulated evidence of what the Pokédex says about it. The question of what it means to have been alive for hundreds of millions of years, and how that duration shapes the kind of entity Rayquaza is. Most living things exist in relationship to time through change. Organisms are born, develop, age, or reproduce, and die. The biological clock of any living thing is tied to a trajectory. There is a beginning and an end, and the entity changes between them. Even the longest-lived creatures in Earth's real biology, bristlecone pines that have persisted for several thousand years, or deep ocean coral colonies that may be tens of thousands of years old, are changing over their lifespans. They are not the same at their end as at their beginning. The Pokédex's characterization of Rayquaza as having lived for hundreds of millions of years without descending to the ground suggests a relationship with time that is qualitatively different from this. It is not that Rayquaza has simply lived longer than other things. It is that its existence has been so continuous and so unchanging in its basic parameters, the ozone layer, the meteoroids, the circling, that it has been doing the same things for longer than most of the geological features of the planet below it have been in their current form. This implies an organism that either does not age in any meaningful biological sense or ages on a timescale so vastly longer than ordinary lifespans that the difference is functionally equivalent to not aging. The specific mechanism is not explained in the lore. It may be connected to the cosmic energy that Rayquaza continuously absorbs from meteoroids, which in the logic of the Pokemon world might provide some form of continuous biological renewal. It may be a property of whatever unique biology Rayquaza has as a creature that has adapted to the conditions of the ozone layer. Whatever the mechanism, the consequence for understanding Rayquaza's character is significant. A creature that has existed for hundreds of millions of years in the same environment doing the same things is not experiencing the world the way that creatures with shorter lifespans and developmental trajectories experience it. The category of surprise, the experience of encountering something genuinely new that changes your model of the world, must operate very differently for something that has been doing the same things since before the continents had their current arrangement. This may be part of what makes Rayquaza's relationship with the Draconid people and with the Black Rayquaza's relationship with Lucius and then with Roy feel distinctive in the lore. The Draconid people's 2,000 years of history is, from Rayquaza's temporal perspective, a recent and brief development. Their entire civilization, from the first descent to the present day of the games, represents roughly 0.02% of Rayquaza's total lifespan if we take hundreds of millions of years at its minimum estimate. The Draconid tradition feels ancient and weighty to human characters who exist within it. To Rayquaza, if it has any sense of temporal scale at all, those 2,000 years are an almost invisible interval, and yet it responds to them. The ritual works. The wish reaches something at that altitude, and something at that altitude descends when the wish is made correctly in the right circumstances. There is something in Rayquaza's nature that is responsive to these short-lived creatures and their carefully maintained traditions, regardless of the vast asymmetry in temporal scale. This responsiveness is one of the more affecting things about Rayquaza in the lore when you sit with it. An entity that has existed since before multicellular life was common on Earth, circling in a region that nothing else occupies, watching the geology of a region form and reform around a war between two other ancient Pokemon with the capacity to overwhelm both of those ancient Pokemon simultaneously at any time, chooses to respond to a wish made by a person carrying a stone at the top of a tower. Not through compulsion, not through any force that the people making the wish could actually apply to something at that altitude, but because its nature, the never-ending appetite for doing what is right, reads the situation correctly and responds. The wish and the response are not symmetric. The person making the wish is expending everything they have to reach something impossibly remote. The thing at that altitude is performing an action that, relative to its capabilities, is comparable to a trained athlete jogging to the mailbox. The asymmetry is vast, and yet the relationship holds across 2,000 years because the thing with the vast capabilities has the orientation to respond to genuine need expressed through the correct form, and the people with the limited capabilities have had the wisdom to maintain that form faithfully for 2,000 years. There is something in this that maps onto the best human traditions of reaching toward what is genuinely larger than oneself. the recognition that the reaching is not reciprocal in scale, but that genuine need expressed through the right kind of asking sometimes finds a response anyway. That the asymmetry of power does not preclude the possibility of relationship if the form of relationship is appropriate to what each party actually is. The Draconid people got this right. That is why they had a tower and a lore keeper in 2,000 years of continuous tradition ready when the asteroid came. The Sky Pillar murals. What they tell us. The murals on the walls of Sky Pillar are one of the more interesting pieces of narrative architecture in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire because they are functioning simultaneously as lore delivery mechanism, atmospheric world building, and character development for Xenia. The way they are presented during the Delta episode's ascent, with Xenia narrating each section as the player climbs toward the summit, creates a structural echo between the physical ascent toward Rayquaza and the narrative ascent through the history of Rayquaza's relationship with the human world. The content of the murals, as reconstructed from Xenia's narration and the in-game dialogue, covers at minimum the following. The original period of Primal Groudon and Kyogre's conflict, the meteoroid shower at Meteor Falls, and the first ascent of Rayquaza, the 1,000-year interval and the second crisis, the second descent, and the mega evolution that drove both primal Pokemon back, the building of Sky Pillar in gratitude and recognition, and the prophecy of the third crisis that is occurring during the events of the Delta episode. What is notable about this coverage is what it chooses to emphasize and what it elides. The murals, as narrated by Xenia, do not focus on Rayquaza's power in purely quantitative terms. They focus on the relationship between Rayquaza and the people who needed it, the meteoroids shining with rainbow light and Rayquaza descending in response, the Lore Keeper making a wish and Rayquaza transforming, the specific emotional quality of the moment when the world was saved, and the specific gratitude that led to the construction of the building the player is currently standing in. This framing suggests something about how the Draconid people understood what they had witnessed. They did not primarily record it as a demonstration of superior firepower, though it was certainly that. They recorded it as an event in which the relationship between the surface world and the sky was expressed at its most explicit. The wish was made. The response came. The world was saved. These are not just facts about Rayquaza's power. They are facts about the specific form that communication between the human world and the sky world can take when both parties perform their roles correctly. The murals are also the record that the Draconid people were making for themselves across 2,000 years, not for an external audience. Sky Pillar is not presented to the player as a public monument that other Hoenn inhabitants visit and revere. It is a specific site for a specific tradition, maintained by a specific group of people, not widely publicized or celebrated. The murals inside it are not for visitors. They are for whoever the next lore keeper is, climbing this tower for the first time and needing to understand everything that has happened before and everything that is about to be required of them. In this sense, the murals are the most important document in the Draconid tradition, not the ritual itself, not the artifact, but the explanatory context that gives the ritual meaning and enables the lore keeper to perform it with understanding rather than just with rote accuracy. A lore keeper who knows only the steps of the ritual but does not understand why each step matters, is more likely to fail at an unexpected moment than one who understands the full history and can adapt if circumstances differ slightly from the historical accounts. The murals provide that understanding. They are the complete context of the tradition, encoded in stone so that even if every oral transmission fails and every human carrier of the knowledge is lost, the stone record at Sky Pillar remains. Any future person who climbs Sky Pillar and can read the murals will be able to reconstruct enough of the Draconid tradition to understand what needs to be done. This is an extraordinarily forward-thinking approach to knowledge preservation, and it reflects the Draconid people's sophisticated understanding of the timescales they were working with. 2,000 years is long enough for civilizations to fall, languages to change beyond recognition, institutions to dissolve, and memories to corrupt. Building redundant preservation into the design of the tradition, encoding the critical knowledge in both oral transmission and permanent stone record, gives the tradition a survival probability that no single channel preservation approach could match. The Draconid people were, in this sense, archivists as much as priests. The tower is a library as much as a temple. The murals are technical documentation as much as religious art. The tradition they maintained is as much a knowledge management challenge as it is a spiritual practice. And the success of the tradition, the fact that Zinnia, in the present day of the games, has the knowledge and the artifact and the understanding to summon Rayquaza when the asteroid comes, is the successful outcome of that 2,000-year knowledge management challenge. That is worth appreciating as its own kind of accomplishment, separate from the spectacular outcome of the Delta episode itself. 2,000 years of an institution functioning correctly, passing knowledge faithfully from person to person across generation after generation, without the ability to test whether the knowledge still works, and without the certainty that it would ever be needed. The Draconid people maintained the tradition through all of that, simply because they understood that the cost of letting it lapse was higher than any inconvenience of maintaining it. They were right, and when the time came, the tradition held. On the nature of legendary Pokemon, Rayquaza as case study. Rayquaza provides one of the clearest case studies in the franchise for what legendary Pokemon actually are, in the sense of what conceptual role they play in the internal logic of the Pokemon world. The franchise has never provided a single unified explanation of what makes a Pokemon legendary. The formal definition is essentially circular. Legendary Pokemon are the Pokemon that are called legendary. But there are patterns across the legendary Pokemon of different generations that suggest a working definition, and Rayquaza fits those patterns in ways that illuminate them. Legendary Pokemon tend to be singular. There is within the normal gameplay of their home game only one of them. This is a statement about their relationship to the world they inhabit. Most Pokemon are species, with populations and reproduction and the normal ecological relationships of species to environments. Legendary Pokemon are individuals, specific unique entities, rather than members of a reproducing population. They are not part of the ecosystem in the way that most Pokemon are. They are more like fundamental features of the world, things that exist as given rather than as outcomes of biological processes. Rayquaza is singular in this sense, There is one Rayquaza in the ozone layer, not a population of Rayquaza adapted to stratospheric life. The lore does not explain how Rayquaza came to be or whether it has any reproductive biology. It simply exists, has existed for hundreds of millions of years, and in the normal functioning of the Pokemon world will presumably continue to exist. Its relationship to time is not biological in the way that most organisms' relationships to time are biological. It does not age and reproduce. It simply persists. Legendary Pokemon also tend to govern or embody some aspect of the physical world at a level that ordinary Pokemon do not. Most Pokemon interact with the world. Legendary Pokemon, in many cases, constitute aspects of the world. They are the processes they govern, rather than creatures that happen to have those powers. Groudon is not a creature that can control land. Groudon is the process that creates continental land, wearing a body. Kyogre is not a creature that can control the ocean. Kyogre is the personification of the sea, as its Pokédex entry says explicitly. Rayquaza is the atmosphere, not a creature that lives in the atmosphere and can influence weather. The atmosphere's governing intelligence, if one wanted to use that language, or the mechanism by which the atmospheric boundary between the planet and space maintains its integrity, if one wanted to use more neutral language. Its presence in the ozone layer is not a creature living in a habitat. It is the thing that makes the ozone layer what it is, by being the apex entity of that specific ecological niche. This understanding of legendary Pokemon as constitutive rather than merely powerful also explains the specific nature of the Rayquaza-Groudon-Kyogre relationship in lore terms. The three members of the Weather Trio are not just the three most powerful Pokemon in the Hoenn region. They are the three fundamental physical systems of a habitable planet: lithosphere, hydrosphere, and atmosphere. The conflict between Groudon and Kyogre is not a conflict between two very strong Pokemon. It is the conflict between the land-making and water-distributing systems of the planet, which is a conflict that, if unresolved, would produce a world that is either all land or all ocean, neither of which is hospitable to the diversity of life that actually exists in Hoenn. Rayquaza's role in this system is not to be the strongest combatant. It is to maintain the balance that makes both of the other systems viable. A world with only land, or a world with only ocean, is not a world where the atmosphere can function the way it normally does either. The three systems are interdependent, Rayquaza maintaining the balance between Groudon and Kyogre is, at a deep level, maintaining the conditions for its own existence as well as for everyone else's. This circularity, the atmosphere's guardian, maintaining the conditions for the atmosphere's continued existence, is actually not paradoxical, but elegant. The system is self-maintaining because each component of it has the nature to maintain the other components. Rayquaza keeps Groudon and Kyogre from destroying the land-water balance. The land-water balance keeps the atmosphere functional. The functional atmosphere supports the conditions in which Rayquaza can exist, as it always has. Everything is in service of everything else. This is, in the Pokemon world's terms, the closest thing to a description of natural balance as an emergent property rather than a designed one, not because anyone planned it this way, but because the components that exist have natures that produce balance when they function as their natures direct them. Rayquaza does not choose balance as a goal. It pursues its territory and its defensive function. The outcome is balance. That is sufficient. One final thought: why it matters. There is a reason that Rayquaza, more than almost any other legendary Pokemon in the franchise, generates the kind of response it does from people who have spent significant time with its story. It is not primarily the power, though the power is real and dramatic. It is not primarily the design, though the design is excellent and consistent. It is not even primarily any single story, though the Delta episode is one of the franchise's great narrative achievements. It is the complete picture, the creature whose existence stretches back to the formation of the land beneath your feet, that has been doing the same thing for longer than multicellular life has existed on Earth in our timeline, that lives in a place you cannot reach and descends only when the world genuinely needs it. That was the first to mega evolve, and in doing so initiated a tradition that transformed how the franchise worked for an entire generation. That was so powerful in its mega form that the organized competitive community had to build a new tier to contain it. That is, right now, in the newest anime series, watching a boy try to become worthy of its partnership. Every layer of that is real, within the context of the story that contains it. Every part of it coheres with every other part. The biological lore feeds the mythological lore, feeds the narrative role, feeds the competitive implications, feeds the ongoing story in Horizons, and all of it circles back to the same essential character, something ancient and powerful and remote that has the orientation to come down when it is needed, that has been coming down when it is needed since before the geography below it had its current form, and that will presumably keep doing so long after the current generation of games and anime are distant memories. That is a legacy worth spending time with. And on that note, that is the full story of Rayquaza, every part of it that currently exists, explored as completely and as slowly as it deserves. If you made it all the way through, drop a comment. Tell me what you will carry away from this one. Tell me where you watched from and what time it was. Tell me which part of the lore you did not know before, and which part hit you differently now that you have the full context. Subscribe if you have not already. Like the video if it was worth your time, and come back for the next one, because we are going to keep going exactly this deep on everything else. Until then, rest well and look up. The Pokemon world's cosmic architecture and where Rayquaza fits. To understand the full significance of Rayquaza in the Pokemon world's cosmological framework, it helps to zoom out even further and think about how the franchise has constructed the physical and metaphysical structure of its world over multiple generations. The Pokemon world is not simply a slightly fantastical version of our own. It has a specific cosmological architecture built piece by piece across games, with different legendary trios and individual Pokemon governing different aspects of reality. The creation trio of Sinnoh, Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina govern time, space, and antimatter respectively, the fundamental substrate of physical existence. Arceus, above them, is the Pokemon that supposedly created the universe. The lake trio of Sinnoh, Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf gave the beings of the world knowledge, emotion, and willpower, respectively. In this architecture, Rayquaza governs a much more specific and local domain, the atmospheric interface of a single planet. It does not govern all sky everywhere. It does not control all atmosphere across all worlds. It governs the ozone layer of the Hoenn region's planet, specifically, and its role as a planetary guardian is bounded by that specific domain. This is not a diminishment. It is, if anything, a clarification that makes Rayquaza more interesting rather than less. The Pokemon world's cosmological architecture has layers, the cosmic level of Arceus and the creation trio, the elemental level of the weather trio and equivalent regional legendary systems, and the mythological level of individual legendary Pokemon embedded in specific regional traditions. Rayquaza operates at the elemental level, governing one of the three fundamental physical systems of a habitable planet within the specific region where those systems are expressed. What makes Rayquaza distinctive, even within that elemental tier, is the specific quality of atmospheric governance it represents. Groudon governs land and Kyogre governs sea, but their governance is primarily expressed through the contest between them and the consequences of that contest for the surface world. Rayquaza's atmospheric governance is expressed differently, through presence and absence, rather than through active engagement with the surface world, through the extreme remoteness of its habitat and the rarity of its descents, through the fact that its most important function is not creating atmosphere, but maintaining the balance that allows atmosphere to remain as it is. This passive maintenance function, staying in the ozone layer, eating meteoroids, occasionally destroying things that threaten the boundary from above, is different in character from the active construction and destruction that Groudon and Kyogre engage in. Rayquaza is not building or shaping the atmosphere. It is defending it. The atmosphere already exists and functions. Rayquaza's job is to ensure that it continues to exist and function by removing threats and imposing order when the Groudon-Kyogre dynamic gets too far out of balance. In a military analogy, Groudon and Kyogre are like two generals fighting a land war, constantly contesting territory and reshaping the battlefield. Rayquaza is like an air power that neither general can compete with, sitting above the conflict and occasionally striking when the conflict threatens to destroy the infrastructure that makes it possible for anything to exist at all. The generals fight. Rayquaza preserves the conditions that allow the fight to be bounded rather than total. This structural role explains why Rayquaza does not simply defeat Groudon and Kyogre permanently. It could, presumably, if it overpowered both of them in their primal forms during the second descent. As the lore establishes, it presumably could simply destroy them. But it does not. It drives them back. It sends them to their respective domains, the earth and the ocean, where they can exist without threatening the surface world or the atmospheric system. The goal is not elimination, but containment. The goal is the restoration of the balance that allows all three elemental systems to continue functioning. This is, if you think about it, the mature and sophisticated version of environmental management, rather than the crude version. The crude version of addressing Groudon and Kyogre would be to eliminate them which would presumably create other problems in a world where the geological and oceanic systems they embody are fundamental to the planet's functioning. The sophisticated version is to maintain them in their domains, allow them to be what they are within the bounds of what is compatible with the continued existence of everything else, and intervene when they exceed those bounds. Rayquaza's never-ending appetite for doing what is right, as the legendary and mythical guidebook puts it, apparently includes the wisdom to do the right thing and not more than the right thing. It restores balance. It does not remake the world. On legends and the people who keep them, there is something worth saying directly about the Draconid people that tends to get absorbed into the spectacular backdrop of Rayquaza's power and the Delta episode's dramatic events. The Draconid tradition is one of the most human-scaled and emotionally resonant things in the Pokemon franchise. The franchise has given us many human institutions over its history. Pokemon League organizations, research labs, Pokemon Ranger groups, various criminal and ideological organizations, government bodies like the International Police. Most of these are active institutions doing things in the present of the games. The Draconid people are almost the opposite, a tradition designed not for present action but for future contingency, maintained across generations by people who knew they would never see the crisis they were preparing for. This is a fundamentally different relationship to institutional purpose than most human organizations have. Most human institutions exist to do things now or in the near future. They are responsive to current conditions. The Draconid people's tradition existed to do something once every 1,000 years, approximately, and required maintaining specific knowledge across the entire interval between uses, without any opportunity to test whether the knowledge still worked. The closest real-world analogs are probably certain kinds of seed banks designed to preserve biological diversity against future catastrophes that may or may not come, or certain kinds of nuclear waste storage projects designed to communicate danger to people thousands of years in the future who will not share our language or cultural context, or the oral traditions of certain indigenous cultures that preserve specific astronomical knowledge across generations, because that knowledge has proved reliable and may prove useful again. In all of these cases, human institutions are grappling with the challenge of preserving something critical across time frames, longer than any individual lifespan and longer than most institutional lifespans. The Draconid tradition solved this problem through the lore keeper role, a specific institutional position with a specific succession process, carrying the knowledge from person to person continuously rather than encoding it in documents that might become unreadable or artifacts that might be misinterpreted. The knowledge was kept alive in living people who understood it because they had been trained to understand it by the previous person who understood it. This is actually one of the most reliable methods of preserving complex knowledge across time, precisely because it keeps the knowledge embedded in human context rather than abstracted into artifacts. A document can be preserved perfectly and still be misread by someone who lacks the context to interpret it correctly. A person who has been trained in the knowledge by another person who has been trained in the knowledge carries both the content and the interpretive context simultaneously. The vulnerability of this approach is that it requires the chain to never break. One generation without a lore keeper, one period where the knowledge goes untransmitted and the whole tradition potentially collapses. The Draconid people clearly recognized this vulnerability and took steps to address it, including the backup record of the murals at Sky Pillar, but the primary transmission method was human to human, lore keeper to lore keeper, across 2,000 years. That chain broke once, at least in the generation of Zinnia and Aster. Aster, the designated lore keeper, died before transmitting the full knowledge to a successor. Zinnia, who had presumably received some portion of the tradition's knowledge, but was not the designated lore keeper, stepped into the role. This is exactly the kind of contingency that the tradition's designers could not fully plan for. The designated carrier dying at an inopportune moment, leaving the institution to improvise its succession. The fact that the tradition survived this break, that Zinnia had enough of the knowledge and the artifact and the understanding to complete the lore keeper's function, even in these non-ideal circumstances, suggests either that the tradition had more redundancy built into it than is immediately apparent, or that Zinnia's knowledge was nearly complete, even if the formal designation was not hers. Either way, the tradition held through a crisis of succession, which is arguably the hardest kind of institutional crisis to survive. And when the moment came, it worked. 2,000 years of a small tribe doing something that no one else in Hoenn knew needed to be done, that most of Hoenn did not even know was possible, maintaining knowledge that had no immediate application and might never have one, and being completely right about its importance. If the Draconid tradition had failed at any point, if the knowledge had been lost or the artifact misplaced, or the succession had broken permanently, the Delta episode of Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire would have been a story about an asteroid hitting the planet with no one able to stop it. The Draconid people are the reason that did not happen. Not Rayquaza alone. Rayquaza plus 2,000 years of human institutional memory and dedication. The combination of the most powerful creature in the sky and the most persistent small group of humans in the region is what saved the world. That is, in the end, the most human story the franchise has told about a legendary Pokemon. Power alone does not solve the problem. Power plus the right form of asking, maintained over long enough time by the right kind of people, does. The aesthetic experience of Rayquaza beyond the lore, and the competitive analysis, and the mythological sources, there is something worth trying to describe about the aesthetic experience of Rayquaza as a Pokemon. What it is like to encounter it, to see it rendered in different contexts, to hold in mind the full weight of what it represents while looking at it. The first encounter in Emerald, climbing to the top of Sky Pillar after the crisis in Sutopolis, reaching the summit and finding the level 70 sprite waiting there, is one of the better staged legendary encounters in the franchise's history, specifically because of what precedes it. You have just seen Rayquaza and a conflict that nothing else could resolve. You have just climbed a tower on a crumbling bike track because the game required forward momentum and would not let you hesitate. And at the top, the encounter that begins is not between an unprepared player and a rare Pokemon they happen to find. It is between a player who knows what this creature just did and the creature that just did it. That context gives the battle a quality that most legendary encounters lack. You are not fighting something powerful because it is rare and therefore presumably powerful. You are fighting something you have direct evidence is powerful, something that you just watched, and a problem that the story told you was unsolvable by any other means. The Pokedex number and the caught not caught flag and the animation of the sprite are all the same as any other legendary encounter. The emotional weight is different. The Delta episode encounter on top of Sky Pillar in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire has a different quality. You are not fighting an unknown. You are fulfilling a ritual that 2,000 years of human preparation has been leading toward, and the outcome of the battle is less important narratively than the fact of it. You battle Rayquaza because that is the form of the invocation, the specific engagement through which the relationship between trainer and legendary is formalized in Pokemon. But the battle feels like ceremony rather than conflict. The Draconid tradition culminates in a battle with Rayquaza at the top of a tower they built to reach it, and you are the player performing the final step of that ceremony. The spaceflight sequence that follows is the franchise's most spectacular visual deployment of a legendary Pokemon as of the date of this script's creation. The specific aesthetics of space in a Pokemon game, stars filling the screen, the planet implied below, the asteroid ahead, Mega Rayquaza's luminous form carrying you through the vacuum, converge into something that feels like the culmination of everything the Hoenn mythology has been building toward. This is what the tower was for. This is what the murals recorded. This is what the 2,000 years of preparation made possible. And then Deoxys emerges from the wreckage, and you have one more battle to fight in space before you can go home. The game does not give you time to process what just happened. It keeps moving. That is correct, narratively. The moment of destruction and the moment of new threat flow into each other without pause, because that is what protecting a boundary looks like. You stop one threat and there is another. Rayquaza in the Destiny Deoxys film looks different from the games because animation has different affordances than sprite-based or even fully rendered game encounters. The film Rayquaza is large, physically intimidating, and moves with a speed and force that communicates power in ways that static encounter screens cannot. It also shows something the games rarely emphasize, what Rayquaza looks like from a relatively small human's perspective, on the ground looking up. The Arctic sequence, the scale of Rayquaza against the ice, and the wide-open sky, the way the battle with Deoxys moves across enormous distances, gives the creature a physical presence that contextualizes the lore claims about its power. The black Rayquaza in Pokemon Horizons has a different aesthetic register from any previous animated appearance. The jet black coloring and the crystalline mega evolution give it something closer to a supernatural quality, less a creature adapted to a natural environment, and more a being that has transcended ordinary categories. The visual language of Horizon's animation style supports this, and the specific combination of the ancient Pokeball, the century-old history, and the deliberate testing of Roy gives the black Rayquaza an emotional presence that the game and film versions, powerful as they are, approached from a different angle. Across all of these contexts, what remains consistent is the sense of scale. Rayquaza is always bigger than the situation it is placed in. Not in a crude way, not in a way that makes the human characters irrelevant, but in the way that truly significant natural forces are always bigger than the specific events they shape. The ozone layer is bigger than Hoenn. The atmosphere is bigger than the region. And the thing that has inhabited the ozone layer for hundreds of millions of years is in some sense bigger than any single encounter or any single crisis, even though it descends to address those specific crises with the full capacity of what it is. That scale, maintained consistently across 20 years of different creative teams and different media and different narrative contexts, is the aesthetic signature of Rayquaza. Not just powerful, vast. Conclusion: everything comes full circle. We began with a simple observation. There is something living above you right now, in the place where the sky transitions to space, circling in the ozone layer, eating whatever falls from beyond the planet, and reflecting that cosmic diet as a luminosity that makes it look, from below, like a meteor. We have traced that something through the geological prehistory of a region that does not yet exist, through the war of two elemental titans whose conflict shapes the coastlines and the mountains, through the first appearance of a tribe of people at a waterfall struck by rainbow-lit meteoroids, who looked at what came from the sky when the meteoroids fell and decided to spend the rest of their civilization's existence making sure they could reach it again. Through 2,000 years of a lore-keeper tradition maintaining the specific knowledge of the specific invocation that would work through the crumbling floors of a tower built for the purpose of bridging the distance between the surface and the sky. Through 4 separate world mythologies, Quetzalcoatl and the Chinese and Japanese dragons, and the Lindworm and the Ziz, all of which contributed pieces of what Rayquaza is and why it looks the way it does, and why it occupies the specific cosmic structural position it does. Through the competitive history that created a new tier called Anything Goes, because no existing structure could contain what happens when the Mikado organ is fully charged and Dragon Ascent is known. Through the Black Rayquaza of Pokemon Horizons and the adventurer Lucius and the boy Roy, trying to become someone a century-old creature with standards would choose to travel with. Through the asteroid and the space flight and the destruction of a meteoroid and the battle with Deoxys in the vacuum above the planet. Every one of those things is part of a single coherent story about a single coherent character. Not a simple character, not a character without complexity or ambiguity, but a coherent one. The thing in the ozone layer that has been there for hundreds of millions of years is the same thing that descended for the Draconid people, that drove Groudon and Kyogre back, that was filmed fighting Deoxys on Arctic ice, and then in the streets of LaRue City, that was banned from Ubers and forced the creation of Anything Goes, that is currently testing a boy named Roy to see if he is worth traveling with, all the same creature, all the same essential nature, ancient, remote, oriented toward action when genuine need is expressed in the correct form, capable of overwhelming force, applied with what might be called purpose, if not exactly wisdom. That coherence, maintained across more than 2 decades and multiple creative teams and multiple media, is the achievement. Not any single story within it, though several of those are great, the whole of it holding together, adding up to something larger than any of its parts. When you look up at the sky, at the part that is too high to be ordinary sky, at the thin blue edge where the atmosphere starts to pale toward black, you can think about what the Pokemon world says lives up there. Not a creature that wants to be found, or that is seeking connection, or that is lonely in any human relatable sense. Something much older than any of that, doing what it has always done, circling in the thin cold air where nothing else can live, waiting for a signal that genuine need is sending from a very long way below. It has been there for a very long time. It will probably be there for a very long time, after everything we know has changed beyond recognition. And occasionally, when the situation is genuinely dire and the right form of asking has been preserved and performed correctly, it comes down. That is the story of Rayquaza. All of it, or all of it that currently exists. Thank you for spending this time with it. If you enjoyed this deep dive, drop a comment below and tell me what part of the lore resonated most with you. Tell me where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. I read every single comment, and I want to know which parts of this story you are carrying with you after the video ends. Subscribe if you have not already. Hit the notification bell so you do not miss what comes next. And like the video if you think other people should find it. Every one of those things so helps more than you might expect. Until next time, rest well and look up. The sound of the sky, Rayquaza's cry and musical identity. One of the dimensions of Rayquaza's identity that rarely receives the attention it deserves in lore discussions is its cry, and more broadly the musical identity that Game Freak has constructed around it in the games. In a franchise where sound design is integral to emotional experience, Rayquaza's sonic presence is worth examining. The cry of Rayquaza in the original Ruby and Sapphire is a long, deep, reverberant sound with a quality that is simultaneously organic and electronic, which is an appropriate combination for a creature that inhabits the interface between the biological and the cosmic. It does not sound like a dinosaur or like any conventional animal. It sounds like something older, something that has been producing that sound in an environment of thin air and cosmic radiation for longer than any living tradition of reference can encompass. The cry is long in duration compared to most Pokemon cries, which matches the sense of a creature operating on longer timescales than the ordinary Pokemon world. In Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, the presentation of Rayquaza's cry during the Delta episode sequences is carefully placed in the context of music that has been building emotional intensity across the entire post-game sequence. The tower climb music, the battle music, the spaceflight sequence's audio design, all of them culminate in the cry's placement as an emotional punctuation mark. When Rayquaza appears in cutscenes or battle openings during the Delta episode, the cry functions less as a Pokemon identification sound and more as a statement of presence, the thing you have been preparing for 2,000 years of in-universe history and however many hours of gameplay is here. The broader musical identity of Sky Pillar as a location is also worth noting. The music used for Sky Pillar in both the original games and the remakes creates a specific atmosphere something between ancient and alien, between familiar and remote. It is music designed for a place that has been standing for thousands of years, waiting for someone to return who needed it. The silence between the musical phrases is part of the effect, the suggestion of great space and great height and great age. Pokemon games have always used music as environmental storytelling, and Sky Pillar is one of the franchise's better examples of a location whose musical identity is perfectly calibrated to its narrative function. You know, from the music alone, before you have read any of the Draconid lore or understood the Delta episode's stakes, that this is a place of significance. The music communicates what the architecture communicates. This is not an ordinary dungeon. This is a place built for something, and the something it was built for has a cry that sounds like it has been echoing in the upper atmosphere for longer than the stone of the tower has been standing. Fan theory and the Rayquaza Ditto connection. No discussion of Pokemon lore would be complete without acknowledging the role of fan theory in extending and enriching the canonical framework. Rayquaza has generated its share of fan theories, and while most of them remain speculation, several of them engage with genuine gaps or ambiguities in the official lore in ways that are worth acknowledging. The most prominent Rayquaza-adjacent fan theory concerns not Rayquaza itself, but the relationship between the origin of Mega Evolution and the Pokemon world's history. The canonical origin story, established through the Delta episode, traces Mega Evolution to the first Mega Rayquaza 2,000 years ago. But the theory that has circulated in fan communities asks a more fundamental question. How did the Mikado organ develop in the first place? The canonical explanation is that the Mikado organ accumulated energy from meteoroids over hundreds of millions of years of stratospheric existence. This is internally consistent with the biology described in the lore. But some fan theorists have argued that the development of an organ specifically capable of achieving the equivalent of a megastone transformation through dietary accumulation in a single organism with no apparent population of similar organisms to provide selective pressure for such a trait is biologically unusual enough to warrant additional explanation. One version of this theory proposes that Rayquaza's Mikado organ is not simply the result of natural biological processes, but is connected to the same catastrophic energy event that created megastones in the first place. If that ancient catastrophe released enormous amounts of energy across the planet and beyond into the upper atmosphere, and if Rayquaza was already living in the upper atmosphere when it happened, the theory proposes that the event may have modified Rayquaza's biology, creating or enhancing the Mikado organ as a consequence of direct exposure to the transformative energy rather than through centuries of dietary accumulation. This theory has the appeal of explaining why Rayquaza is the only organism with a functional internal equivalent of a megastone. It was the only organism in the right place at the right time when the energy event occurred. It also creates a historical connection between Rayquaza and the broader phenomenon of megastones that would make the Draconid observation, seeing Rayquaza react to keystones, even more meaningful. If Rayquaza's Mikado organ and the megastones share a common energy origin, then Rayquaza's response to keystones is the recognition of related energy rather than an arbitrary resonance. This remains fan theory rather than canonical fact, and the official lore's dietary accumulation explanation is sufficient within the game's logic. But the fan theory version is not inconsistent with the canonical lore and adds an interesting dimension to the question of what Rayquaza actually is and how it came to have the specific biology it has. Other fan theories have engaged with the question of whether Rayquaza exists in multiple parallel worlds simultaneously, drawing on the parallel worlds concept that appears in the Delta episode and in the Pokemon multiverse, lore developed across ORAS and other games. The Draconid tradition apparently anticipates this question in its resistance to Devon's space warping solution. If the asteroid was redirected to a parallel world where Rayquaza does not exist, that world lacks the defense mechanism. But this also implies that not all parallel Pokemon worlds necessarily have a Rayquaza, which raises questions about the structure of the Pokemon multiverse that the games have not fully resolved. The fan theory space around Rayquaza, while speculative, reflects genuine engagement with the lore's implications and the genuine gaps and ambiguities it contains. This is, in its own way, a form of the same impulse that drove the Draconid people to study the patterns of the sky and build an institution around what they found, the recognition that what is visible and documented is the beginning of an understanding, not the end of one. Every trainer who ever climbed Sky Pillar, there is a dimension of Rayquaza's cultural legacy that exists not in the lore or the competitive analysis or the mythological sources, but in the lived experience of millions of players who climbed Sky Pillar in Pokemon Emerald, specifically in the specific circumstances of the story's crisis. The experience of the Emerald Sky Pillar sequence as a player goes something like this. You have been playing through the story of a region that is being torn apart by two ancient Pokemon. You have dealt with villain teams and gyms and rival battles and all the normal structures of a Pokemon story. And then both villain teams succeed at once, and the weather in Sootopolis City becomes something the game's systems cannot resolve. Sun and rain fighting each other to a standstill, while two enormous ancient creatures stand at the center of a populated area and fight. Wallace appears and acknowledges the situation directly. He does not pretend there is a conventional solution. He says there is a legend. He says Sky Pillar. He says go, and you go, past Pacifidlog Town and the floating logs and the bizarre weather conditions of Route 131, to the island, up to the entrance, and then the crumbling floors, the mock bike, the specific experience of having to go forward at speed because hesitation means falling, the encounter at the top, the brief transmission that Rayquaza descended to Sootopolis, the clearing of the weather, the retreat of the ancient Pokemon. All of this happens through minimal visual means, and the minimalism is correct. The game trusts you to understand what happened without showing you every detail of it, and then you go back, and the mock bike puzzle is there again, harder this time, because the stakes feel different, because now you know what is at the top, and the knowledge of what is at the top gives the crumbling floors a different weight. You are not just navigating a puzzle, you are climbing back up to something that just saved the world, to fight it properly with Pokeballs and status moves and strategy, to catch it if you can. Every player who went through that sequence carries something from it, not just the catch rate and the level and the moveset of the Rayquaza they caught. The specific quality of that ascent under the knowledge of what the creature at the top had just done. The specific feeling of the game trusting you to connect the sequence in Sootopolis with the encounter at the top of the tower without over-explaining it. The Delta episode in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire layered additional meaning onto this for players who had done the original Emerald sequence. If you climbed Sky Pillar in Emerald and then climbed it again in Oras with Zinnia narrating the Draconid murals, the two experiences informing each other, the second climb reveals the full context of what the first one was always about. You were not just going to catch a legendary Pokemon, you were completing a ritual 2,000 years in the making, even though the game did not tell you that the first time. That retroactive revelation of significance, the discovery that something you did years ago in a different game was more meaningful than you realized, is one of the more unusual experiences the franchise has offered across its history, and Rayquaza is at the center of it. Every trainer who ever climbed Sky Pillar in Pokemon Emerald was within the logic of the Pokemon world, doing exactly what the Draconid Lorekeeper tradition had been preparing for 2,000 years. They just did not know it yet. A note on what we have covered. 24,000 words in, it is worth pausing to acknowledge what ground we have crossed together. We traced the geological prehistory of a fictional region back to a conflict between primordial forces old enough to make the human concept of ancient feel inadequate. We sat with the specific biology of a creature that has eaten cosmic debris in the thin air above the planet for longer than multicellular life has existed on Earth in our world. We mapped the mythological traditions of 4 separate human cultures onto a Pokemon design and found that each mapping was more precise than the last. We followed one small tribe of people through 2,000 years of institutional memory, watching them build a tower and train a succession of knowledge keepers so that when the catastrophic cycle came around again, the right person would be ready with the right artifact and the right understanding. We watched that readiness pay off in a post-game narrative that sent a player character into outer space on the back of a dragon and came home after destroying an asteroid and fighting an alien in the void. We traced the biological mechanism that gives Rayquaza its unique competitive status, naming it after the concept of divine imperial authority over the heavens, and followed the consequence of that mechanism through the competitive history that required the invention of a new tier to contain what the mechanic produced. We picked up the thread of the story in its most recent iteration in a jet black Rayquaza sealed in an ancient Pokeball at the bottom of the ocean, waiting for a boy to become worthy of it. All of it connects. All of it rewards the time it takes to understand. If this video found you, you are exactly the kind of person who is always going to find it. Rest well and look up.